Chapter 8:10. Simulacrum. This was the spell that Soren found in the ancient ruins. As a relatively strange level 8 spell, Simulacrum was currently mastered by very few people. He also found a way to bring it back, and then he gave the mask imprinted with the Simulacrum spell to the fallen witch and Gloria. They were the ones who studied it and finally completed the model analysis of the spell. This spell was widely used during the Arcane Empire, mainly because the great arcanists had too many things to deal with. In this case, even if one person was divided into two people, it might not be enough. Therefore, at that time, the great arcanists were very committed to studying projection and simulacrum spells. According to the information that Soren learned from Gloria, he knew that the high-level members of the Northern Witch Council had mastered a very special holographic projection spell. Unlike those projection spells that were easily above level 4 or 5, this spell required only level 2 or 3 to cast. Holographic projection was a level 3 spell, and planar projection was a level 2 spell. As long as a level 4 or 5 wizard, they could master it. But the only trouble was that this spell seemed to require a very sophisticated alchemy device. At present, the application of this spell was limited to the many towers of the Northern Witch Council. It seems that this spell is very useful for our future research. As if she was interested in Fallen Witch's test, Gloria's attention was completely removed from the experiment. She slowly said, "What are the results of the test? Can you control the main body and simulacrum at the same time for research?" Fallen Witch shook her head and said, "Not at the moment. Mind control is mainly focused on the main body, but the simulacrum created can help with some simple things. And the most powerful part of this spell is that the simulacrum created has the ability to cast spells. It can probably retain 70 to 80% of my casting ability." This was the most perverted part of simulacrum. It could create a clone that could cast spells. For a wizard, this was equivalent to increasing the number of low-level spell slots by a large margin. In normal experiments, there was no need to waste time memorizing spells after using them up. Of course, that was not all. It could be used in a wide range of fields. However, this spell had a very high requirement on one's mind. Multitasking was the most basic. If one's brain wasn't developed enough, one wouldn't be able to control it at all. Note, mimicry can only copy and retain part of the original body's strength. It cannot create or copy magic items. The clothes and weapons on the simulacrum are just ordinary items created by magic. They only look the same, but they are actually useless. Is that so? Gloria fell into deep thought. She was around level 21 as a wizard. If she kept 80% of her power, she would be around level 16. In terms of talent, Gloria was even stronger than the Fallen Witch, so she was definitely a genius at multitasking. If she could master this spell, it would be equivalent to having an assistant similar to himself when he was a high-grade wizard. Apart from the very precise magic experiments that couldn't be done, ordinary alchemy experiments could be done at the same time. Where's the spell model? Let me have a look. Gloria thought for a moment and continued, "Give one to Alice while you're at it. It seems that our progress will be much faster in the future." During this period of time, the legendary girl puppeteer had gradually integrated into the environment of Mordor City. Compared with the eastern countries where there were few wizards and most of them were sorcerers, the research environment of Mordor City was undoubtedly more suitable for Alice. More importantly, Mordor City had the corresponding golem puppet technology, which would greatly improve her craftsmanship in making golem dolls. Recently, Alice was going to make a girl puppet group for herself, ready to use the strange silver-white metal from the Arcane Tower. This metal was currently named thorium. The name was used more because it was born in the age of thorium. As early as the time of the first goddess of magic, the arcane civilization with the floating city had already appeared, and this metal ingot had been used at that time. Hearing this, the Fallen Witch also nodded. She was the kind of typical profit-oriented person. If Alice's existence was not beneficial to Mordor City, then she would definitely object to teaching her such an important spell. But now Alice had been in charge of the operation of the Golem factory in Mordor City. Alchemy advocated equivalent exchange. Alice obtained knowledge from Mordor City, so she naturally hoped that she could provide corresponding value. The three legendary female spellcasters were all inclined to the academic madman type, so they had been getting along well. In any case, the fallen witches might be evil in their behavior, but they were still academic witches in nature. They were less scheming than other witches. Wind Spear Hills. Lord's Mansion. After dealing with Shipwreck Bay, Soren immediately came to the Wind Spear Hills. After all, this was the key to his future plan. The Wind Spear Hills was close to the north, and it was a fertile plain. In the future, if Mordor City wanted to interfere with the pattern of the mainland, it would definitely need a foothold. Adele Isabella was now the lord of the Wind Spear Hills. With Mordor City as a backing, other forces would not dare to cause any trouble. However, after coming to the Wind Spear Hills today, Soren found something wrong. He saw a woman. Soren's memory had always been very good. If he remembered correctly, he had seen this woman before. At that time, Soren was still in Port Tylon. In order to get Soren to join the Sea Church, the Sea Priest at that time found a noble girl. It seemed that she was going to use her beauty to seduce Soren to join her camp, but Soren refused without hesitation. Today, Soren saw that girl. If he remembered correctly, the name of this noble girl was Monica Isabella. She had the same surname as the red-haired female pirate. Maybe they were cousins. When he saw this woman, Soren was a little surprised, but he was in a hurry and had something to deal with, so he didn't ask much. It seemed that she was Adele Isabella's assistant, helping her deal with the documents in the Wind Spear Hills. Soren came here this time to explain something, mainly to prevent the power of the Shadow Thief from infiltrating the Wind Spear Hills. Night fell. Soren returned to the City Lord's mansion after explaining things in the temple. Because the situation was not good, he planned to leave an archbishop of the half-elf church here. If there was a legendary priest, other forces would have to think twice if they wanted to make trouble. In the evening, Soren received good news. Gloria used magic to tell him that the analysis of the simulacrum had been completed. As long as he went back, he could get the copied magic scroll. Because of the fierce conflict with the Shadow Lord, the defense of the Wind Spear Hills had increased a lot. However, Soren's place did not need to be like this because his perception was better than any guard. Light footsteps could be heard. Unsurprisingly, when Soren stayed in the Wind Spear Hills, Adele Isabella came to sleep with him almost every night. She was now a fanatic of Soren, and in the future, she might even be a holy apostle in the kingdom of God. This kind of close relationship meant that she was destined to be one of Soren's most trusted subordinates. However, today's situation seemed to be a little unexpected because Soren heard two footsteps. In addition to Adele Isabella, there was another light footstep. It seemed to be a little messy, and the owner's mood was a little hesitant and panicked. "My lord." Soon, the voice of the red-haired female pirate sounded outside the door. Soren slightly raised his eyebrows and said, "Come in." Creak. The door was gently pushed open, and then Adele Isabella, who was wearing a thin dress and almost nothing inside, came in. But a little different from the past was that this time, there was another slim woman behind her. It seemed to be the noble girl named Monica Isabella that he saw every day. She had beautiful long blonde hair, and her expression seemed to be a little uneasy. She carefully followed behind and walked in. One thing worth noting was that this noble girl also had Soren's emblem on her chest. A rogue. Soren glanced at her and raised his eyebrows in surprise. He was a little surprised that this noble girl had advanced into a rogue and was a follower of his church. The room was very quiet. Soren glanced and turned his attention back to the magic scroll on the table. He was trying to learn the first legendary spell, which might take a lot of time. After Adele Isabella entered the room, she did not disturb Soren. First, she obediently tidied up the bed for him, and then put the books on the table next to him. She looked like a very dedicated maid. On the other side, the blonde noble girl was still standing in the same place, but after the initial panic, she calmed down a little and looked at Soren curiously from time to time. after everything in the room was tidied up. Adele Isabella very docilely came to Soren's side, then knelt down and crawled to the front of Soren. The bottom of the desk was hollow. The female lord of the Wind Spear Hills, who was usually admired and pursued by countless young nobles, was now kneeling at Soren's feet like the most humble maid, dutifully doing what a maid should do, such as how to please and serve her master at night. On the other side, Monica Isabella, who had beautiful long blonde hair, widened her eyes in surprise. Her face was crimson, as if she wanted to look but did not dare to. However, her conflicted expression did not last long, because Adele Isabella looked at her and then waved her hand to let her come over. Like this. You suck on the other side. Don't use your teeth. As a lowly maid, you need to learn more skills. While Adele Isabella was seriously serving and pleasing her master, she was also instructing the noble girl next to her, who was nominally her cousin. Soren only took a deep breath at the beginning, then continued to flip through the books in front of him as if nothing had happened. The thinking ability of a god was far superior to others. Such a small matter was not enough to affect his serious study of magic knowledge. Monica Isabella was obviously a smart and studious noble girl, so she quickly mastered a few skills and successfully learned how a competent maid should use her mouth to please her master. At this time, Adele Isabella stood up and gently sat next to Soren, whispering, "My lord, I've touched the threshold of the legendary realm. At present, things in the Wind Spear Hills have begun to get on the right track, and I plan to spare some time to cultivate and break through. Monica Isabella is my aunt's daughter, and she is a trustworthy person. I'm going to let her take care of the Wind Spear Hills for me for a while. And her family background is also very useful to us." Sure enough, Soren had already guessed that Adele Isabella had something to tell him, otherwise, she would never have brought this noble girl over tonight. Soren looked at her seriously. Sure enough, he found that the red-haired female pirate already had a trace of a legendary profession, which meant that she had reached a threshold, and as long as she succeeded in crossing it, she would be a legendary figure. It seemed that the giant had given the other pirate leaders a lot of pressure after breaking through the legendary realm. Soren secretly had rogues pay attention to this pirate leader. On one hand, it was convenient to contact them, and on the other hand, it was to prevent them from being bribed. Since the giant had broken through the legendary realm, many pirate leaders felt a lot of pressure. Even the half-elven first mate, who had always been superior to others, had recently handed over the affairs of Raging Sand Island to his deputy, while he concentrated on finding ways to break through the legendary realm. If he did not enter the legendary realm, he would never be able to enter the real upper echelons of Mordor. These pirate leaders, such as the half-elven first mate, Scarface, One-Eyed, Knight, Sea Dog, and so on, seemed to have thousands of pirates under them. But in fact, the real power of Mordor was never these pirates. The real elites had gathered inside Mordor, and if they did not enter the legendary realm, they were not qualified to enter the highest decision-making team of Mordor. This point, even Saruman was the same. Back to the topic. After hearing Adele Isabella mention herself, the blonde noble girl who was kneeling at the feet of Soren paused for a moment, and then slowly returned to normal. Soren closed his eyes and pondered for a moment, then said, "I understand. Okay. In the future, the affairs of the Wind Spear Hills will be temporarily handed over to her, but your cultivation can only be done inside the Wind Spear Hills. I'm afraid only you can control those pirates. Okay. About her, I'll say hello to the Sea Temple." If Soren remembered correctly, the noble girl under his feet seemed to have something to do with the Sea Temple. It seemed that she needed help from the Sea Temple. The Sea Temple did not have enough influence on the land. It seemed that because of something he didn't know, she actually got in touch with Adele Isabella, and now seemed to be planning to join the camp of Mordor. He had no objection to this. The surname, Isabella, had a special purpose. She herself was an Orthodox noble, so she could use it in many places. Even if she didn't use it, she could still make do with it. However, after all, this matter was still related to the Sea Temple. Even if Soren's relationship with the sea goddess was relatively harmonious, this noble girl was still a chess piece of the Sea Temple buried on the land. Now that she was going to join the Mordor, he still needed to send someone to greet the Sea Temple. However, fate was really unpredictable. At the beginning, the High Priest of the Sea used her to lure Soren, hoping that he could join the Sea Goddess, but he didn't expect this noble girl to become the assistant of the red-haired female pirate. He had to say that fate was really interesting. P.S. It's still a 2-in-1 chapter. You can pay attention to the public account, and anything will be notified in advance. Chapter 8-11. The Outer Islands. Mordor City. Today, Mordor City was a little lively because many residents of Mordor City gathered near the central square. At the moment, they were looking at the center of the square curiously. In the center of the square was a group of gray dwarves gathered together. They looked ragged and wore animal skin clothes. They looked like savages with disheveled hair and long beards. Around the square was a team of drows, staring at them coldly at the moment. Not far away, there were priests of the temple who seemed to be discussing how to settle these gray dwarves. Suddenly coming to a strange environment, these gray dwarves also looked a little uneasy. There were not many of them, only about 200 or 300 of them. At the moment, they were surrounded by a group of residents of Mordor City. Although they saw the drows from the Underdark, these gray dwarves still looked nervous. The residents of Mordor City were well informed, but their curious nature had not changed much. Many of them saw the gray dwarves for the first time. Maybe because of the confidence of the residents of Mordor, they were not afraid of these legendary evil races. Instead, they looked around curiously. The drows were much more evil than the gray dwarves in the legends. You see, they were quite obedient in Mordor City. They were tamed by Sir Soren and got along well with other races. It was said. One of the drows fell in love with a pure half-elf girl, and their relationship was blessed by the bishop of the Great Temple. This was Mordor City. It was not the same as any city in the material plane. Okay. The drows came to the gray dwarves with a cold expression and said in a deep voice, "His Excellency the High Priest has arranged your residence. From now on, you are the residents of Mordor City. The target is to live in the blacksmith shop next to the barracks. If you have enough contributions in the future, you can also buy your own business in Mordor City." After a few words, the drows ordered the gray dwarves to set off. After all, the gray dwarfs were a foreign race. It would take a little bit of effort for the residents of Mordor City to accept them. Therefore, they could only live near the barracks for the time being, so they could be monitored and learn the rules of Mordor City. The nature of the gray dwarves was not very good, but the laws of Mordor could tame them. Now the drow instructor in front of him was thinking about how to find an opportunity to beat these gray dwarves. Let them know that they had to be honest if they wanted to live in Mordor City. At the other side, the figure of the High Priestess was sitting on the throne in front of the temple. Around her were high-ranked priests and bishops. She looked around and slowly said, "This is the arrangement of my lord. These Durgar are the labor force needed for the future development of Mordor. From now on, I'll leave them to you to keep an eye on. There's still a group of gray dwarves I haven't brought back yet. In the future, the number of gray dwarves in Mordor City will be about 1,000. You need to pay more attention here, don't let them have any conflicts with the residents of Mordor City." At the other side, in the Shadow Plane Laboratory in Mordor City, Gloria also quickly received the news. So, she immediately found the Fallen Witch who was studying and said, "Mother, Soren has sent people to get the gray dwarves back. When do you think we can start letting these gray dwarves forge materials for us? A floating space tower needed a lot of metal ingots. These little things couldn't always be done by the two legendary witches. Mordor City itself didn't have good blacksmiths, and it took a lot of energy to cultivate them. The gray dwarves were born to be good blacksmiths. With the help of these gray dwarves, not only would the progress of the floating space tower speed up, but even the output of the golem factory would increase. Now there were thousands of golem puppets in Mordor City. Wind Spear Hills. After a night of indulgence, Soren felt good. After explaining some things to Adele Isabella, he was ready to return to Mordor City. He didn't have much nostalgia for the two beautiful noble maids. For a high and mighty true God, these things were just pleasure for him to relax occasionally. As a god, he always had a lot of things to deal with. It was already March. The goddess of magic hadn't fallen yet, but no one knew her whereabouts. Even Soren couldn't find her on his own initiative. Something big would happen this month. That was the demon lord of the abyss, Dagon, one of the ancient Orbis demons. After the other demons' first 2 attacks failed, Dagon began to infiltrate the sea domain of the material plane. This action affected the entire overseas area. Soren had participated in this war and also received a mission from the Sea Temple. Because the battle took place in the sea area, the impact on the land was not very serious, so most of the other gods were just watching. However, the overseas area was Soren's territory. If Dagon was allowed to cause damage, Mordor City's maritime trade would definitely be affected. This time, he needed to plan in advance to reduce Mordor City's investment in maritime trade. After the goddess of the sea and Dagon had a winner, he would consider rearranging many overseas routes. There was about half a month before the war broke out. The son of Dagon would appear again, and there would be more than one because this ancient demon lord had many children. The Naga Sirens would be the most severely affected race. The first 2 demon attacks didn't affect them much, but no one could be alone in the Avatar crisis. This time, the Naga Sirens would have to bear the impact by themselves. The City of Wealth. In a hidden tavern, Ugly Monkey looked at his men in front of him and said slowly, "Are you sure this information was taken from the Shadow Thief?" In front of him was a middle-aged man with a cold expression. He was dressed well and said, "Yes. I have sent people to investigate. We did find a lot of members of the Shadow Thief. But the internal security is tight, and we have no way to infiltrate." Ugly Monkey's face showed a hint of excitement and said slowly, "We finally found these guys who hide their heads and tails. Leave and send people to rule the temple. Ask them to send assassins over. Maybe we can find the Shadow Thief's nest this time." The middle-aged man nodded and said, "Yes. I'll do it now." After the man in front of him left, Ugly Monkey's expression gradually calmed down and murmured, "If I can kick out the Shadow Thief's branch this time, then I will have made a great contribution. Maybe my Lord Soren will give me some rewards." Thinking of this, Ugly Monkey's eyes suddenly became fiery. As a profession close to the legendary realm, there were not many things he wanted. He hoped that he could go one step further, and it would be best if he could get divinity and divine power. Because Ugly Monkey hoped that if he died in the future, he could get the status of God's servant in Soren's kingdom. One day later, Soren returned to Mordor City. The high priest had brought back some grey dwarves, which was undoubtedly good news. Because this meant that Mordor City had the ability to produce its own military equipment. City Lord's Mansion. After Soren returned to Mordor City, he saw Gloria for the first time. But what surprised him a little was that Gloria used to spend most of her time in the laboratory in the Shadow Plane, but this time she was quite leisurely dealing with the affairs and documents of Mordor City in the hall. There was also a cup of black tea from the Eastern Kingdom next to her. "Hey." Soren glanced at the Northern Witch in front of him, then walked behind her and was ready to take her into his arms. He said slowly, "How's the progress of the floating space tower? How do you have time to sit here and drink tea today?" Gloria turned her head and looked at Soren. She smiled mischievously and said softly, "Take a guess." A beauty in his arms. Soren had just held Gloria in his arms, and immediately felt that something was wrong. He was surprised and said, This is. No wonder. No wonder. It felt a little different. Although there seemed to be no difference, Soren immediately noticed something was wrong after close contact. This was not Gloria. In other words, this was not Gloria's body. Simulacrum. Soren raised his head in surprise and looked at Gloria, who was blushing in front of him. He put his hand directly under her long skirt, and then kept groping. The more he groped, the more surprised he was. He murmured, "It's so magical. This feels so real." Gloria's breathing was a little short, and her beautiful face was already blushing. She whispered, simulacrum itself is similar to true mirror image, so the avatar created is real. Soren's fingertips turned, and he had touched the soft and towering fullness from the skirt. He fiddled with it a few times, and he saw Gloria gasping. He was in disbelief at the moment, and whispered, even this feeling can be simulated? It seems that I have underestimated the effect of simulacrum. This was the avatar of a god. The effect of simulacrum was much stronger than projection. The two were not on the same level at all. How much of the spell's power is retained? Soren did not take back his hand, but he continued to play with the two white balls and said, the magic equipment on the body can't be simulated, right? Gloria's breathing became more rapid, and she gently shook her head, magic equipment can't. But 80% of the spellcasting power is retained. The avatar I created can cast spells up to the 8th circle. But the spells that can be cast can only be those that are remembered by my body. This was already very good. After hearing this, Soren fell into deep thought. It seemed that he was thinking about the other uses of simulacrum's power. At the same time, in the experiment in the shadow plane, Gloria and Fallen which were working on the production of a large floating ring. Suddenly, Gloria's breathing became chaotic, and even the control of the spell fluctuated slightly. Everyone present was a legendary witch. Karina, the Fallen witch, immediately sensed something unusual. She asked, "What's wrong? Why is your face a little red?" Gloria looked at her mother with a guilty conscience, and then said, "Soren is back. I was talking to him just now, and I was a little distracted." Fallen witch seemed to think of something. She looked at her daughter meaningfully, and then whispered, "Don't be distracted. If the production of this large floating ring fails, I'm afraid it will take a long time. What new tricks do you young people want to play? You'd better wait until nighttime to try them out." Gloria's face suddenly turned red. She opened her mouth to explain something, but found that there was no way to explain it. The more she tried to explain, the worse the situation would become. So, she directly cancelled the effect of simulacrum. The mayor's mansion. Soren was just holding Gloria and studying the differences between the avatars created by simulacrum. He touched them for a while and found that almost all aspects were the same. There were no changes at all in size and curves. But when he stretched out 2 fingers to explore whether there were any changes inside, Gloria in his arms suddenly dissipated in the wind, turned into magic energy and disappeared in front of him. The effect of simulacrum was cancelled. He didn't know whether Gloria cancelled the effect of the spell on her own initiative, or the spell's duration was up. Soren didn't care very much. Anyway, this kind of thing could be studied slowly. Multitasking was difficult for mortals, but it was easy for Soren. He himself had a demon avatar. If he succeeded in mastering simulacrum, then he could control 3 avatars at the same time. The demon avatar would have about 70% of his strength, and simulacrum could retain up to 80% of his strength. As long as Soren could control it with his mind, coupled with the strength of his original body, it would be a total combat power. One person could beat up a group of people. "My lord." A middle-aged priest wearing an archbishop's robe came in and bowed respectfully to Soren. He then said, "The lurkers have found traces of the shadow thieves. If we can follow the clues, we might be able to find their nest." Soren's spirit was lifted when he heard this. He then said, "Very good. Send more people over immediately. Ask the church to send a group of high-grade priests to help them. If you find any information related to the Shadow Lord, inform me immediately." The middle-aged priest bowed and left. Soren stood in place and thought for a moment. Then he sent out 2 magic messages. "We found clues about the Shadow Lord. Prepare for battle." The 2 magic messages were sent. One was to Princess Royal, and the other was to Ascendant Eugene. Only these 2 were qualified to fight against the Shadow Lord. P.S. It's still a 2-in-1 chapter. Simulacrum's effect was originally on the body, but it's gone now. I'll explain it to you first. I'll write it later when I have time. Chapter 8:12. Asterisk rumble. Asterisk the sound of buildings collapsing could be heard, and the city wall was finally breached. Tens of thousands of demons poured in from the gap, and the soul catcher in the lead was extremely excited as it slaughtered crazily. Sauron's figure stood in a sea of fire, and in his hand was a burnt head. The enemy's demon lord had been killed, and the remaining demon leaders were either stubbornly resisting or fleeing. This battle between the demon lords ended with Sauron's complete victory. From now on, this territory would completely belong to him, and a part of the enemy's army would be taken over by him. The battle between demons was very cruel. However, it was also this kind of cruel slaughter that allowed the demons to quickly level up. In just one battle, there were hundreds of intermediate demons under Sauron's command. These rookies who stood out from the low-level demons through slaughter would obtain the status they deserved. Master. After killing a berserk demon, Lady Succubus returned to Sauron. In fact, with her strength, she could have leveled up again, but she obviously preferred the form of a succubus, so she chose to continue leveling up in the form of a succubus. Many demons in the abyss would choose their favorite form to maintain for a long time. Although the succubus was only in the form of an intermediate demon, if it advanced to the realm of legends, it would still have other forms to improve. The flames on Sauron's body gradually extinguished. Lady Succubus carefully looked at him and slowly said, "We found a lot of succubus in the back palace. Master, do you want to take them as trophies or?" At this point, her voice paused for a moment. Succubus's status in the abyss was quite special. Although they were demons, they were often used as wealth and goods to be traded. The demon lords would treat them as a kind of wealth and use them to reward their subordinates or trade. Many succubus' fate was quite tragic, and they didn't have the slightest bit of personal freedom. This was what Lady Succubus was asking. How did Sauron plan to deal with these succubus? If he intended to recruit them as subordinates, then the fate of these succubus would be better. They would have relative personal freedom and the same authority as other demons. However, if Sauron only intended to use them as items, then the status of these succubus would be similar to slaves, and they wouldn't have the slightest bit of personal freedom. In the future, they would be imprisoned until they could be used. Incorporate them. Incorporate these succubi into the army, and you will be the commander from now on. You'll be in charge of the army. Sauron said after thinking for a while. Using succubus as items was not a good thing for him because succubus were one of the few middle-level demons with good brains. Moreover, because the succubus camp was not as chaotic as the other demons, he was very convenient to use. Some things were more efficient to hand over to them than to other demons. However, if he promised so, these succubus would be Sauron's subordinates in the future. He could no longer treat them as commodities, nor could he easily deprive these succubus of their freedom and casually sell them to other demons. Of course, he basically wouldn't do such a thing. My lord is so kind. Lady Succubus looked very happy. After bowing, she prepared to incorporate the succubus. No matter what, they were the same kind of demon, and she obviously didn't want to see them treated like slaves or goods. Even demons needed a little dignity. Even succubus found it difficult to accept being treated as slaves and commodities. As if hearing his order, the other high-level succubus next to him could not help but look at Sauron, and a smile seemed to appear at the corner of her mouth. In the battle just now, she seemed to be very skillful, and even Sauron could not guess her strength for a while. Sauron wondered if she had anything to do with the succubus queen. A succubus with strength close to or even beyond legendary seemed to be close to the level of the Radiance nuns. Most of the succubus of this level should have been recruited by the succubus queen. The origin of this high-level succubus was a little unclear, and it happened to appear when the succubus queen disappeared and many Radiance nuns were fighting for power. It had to be said that this was a great coincidence. If Sauron didn't think of anything, then he would really be brainless. But the problem was that some things could not be made clear now. He needed to find an opportunity to test the other party. Because at least for now, she did not have the slightest hostility to Sauron. On the contrary, she was very docile most of the time. Send someone to count the spoils. Incorporate the surrendered demons. Pay attention to those demons and don't let them get close to the enemy's treasury. These orders were issued to the demons and goblins. Sauron could not fully trust the demons. They were the mercenaries of this battle, so they must not be allowed to get close to the enemy's treasury. This battle was not a small loss for Sauron. But as long as he won, everything was worth it. He could quickly recover and strengthen after annexing the enemy's army. At the same time, after combining the power of the two territories, Sauron felt that he was about to get a virtual divinity close to minor divine power. Of course, this kind of power was only effective in his own territory. Demon lords could assimilate the power of the bottomless abyss. If they were strong enough, they could also change the law of a land like the devils. After successfully killing a lesser demon lord, Sauron finally ushered in the long-awaited breakthrough, and he also received a full 12 divinity points. These divinity points were still in the body of the demon incarnation. Maybe in the future, they would be combined at the right time. Because the original body and the incarnation could be combined. But there was a prerequisite, and that was that Sauron was really prepared to descend into the bottomless abyss. Only in this way could he turn from an evil god into an abyss demon and finally successfully combine the power of the demon incarnation. Name, Sauron. Race, demon. Form, Balrog, elite, grade 5, large otherworld creature, transdimensional, evil, level, creature level 24 attributes, strength 34, dexterity 22, constitution 27, intelligence 25, wisdom 25, charm 27 alignment, lawful evil. Note, other demons will be slightly hostile to your actions. HP, 381475 demonic energy, 150660000. Domain, rage, evil skills, sneak 215, deception 185, negotiate 155, literacy 180, intimidation 320, spellcraft 150, use magic device 180, listen 135, detect 135, search 120 abilities, gaze of fear, spirit of fear, body of flames, whip of flames, bind, demon claws, +1 natural magic weapon, demon skin, damage reduction +10, demon resistance, all types of resistance +10. Abilities, dual wielding, master of preemptive attacks, multi-attack, weapon mastery, beheading sword, exotic weapon mastery, whip, fierce attack. Spell-like abilities, summon demon army, soul assimilation, telekinesis, blasphemous words, greater teleportation, fear, at will, fireball, 5 times per day, instant cast, dominate demon, once per day, burning hand, summon demon, telepathy. Balrog, elite, form. Sauron felt that he was only one step away from becoming a Balrog. And with his current strength, perhaps his strength would far exceed that of an ordinary Balrog. The elite form didn't have many abilities. It only increased Sauron's attributes and added an evil domain. Of course, the most important improvement was not this, but Sauron had an additional spell-like ability. Summon Demon Army. It was a legendary spell that was independent of the original summon demons because of the increase in the demon lord's ability. Summon Demon Army, legendary spell. As a powerful demon lord, you can cast this legendary spell-like ability once per day. This spell will summon 1 to 2 assassin demons, 2 to 4 soul judgment demons, Glabriza demons, or 6 armed snake demons from the demons you control. At the same time, it will summon 4 to 8 berserk demons, flaming demons, or succubus, etc. This spell will also summon a large number of low-grade demons, including but not limited to Dretch, Quasits, berserk demons, etc. The number of low-grade demons summoned is about 36 to 108. This was a very powerful ability. The effect of the spell was far beyond other types of summoning abilities. Only the demon lord of the abyss could summon so many demons at once. My creature level is already 24. Sauron looked at his data page and said to himself, now it's just one step away. As long as my creature level is raised to about 25, I should be able to advance into the Baelor form, or the Baelor form. Demons did not need to accumulate their original form. Because every time they refreshed a new form, it was equivalent to reconstructing their body. However, Sauron's current situation was a bit special. Balor and Balor were very similar forms. Unlike succubus and berserk demon, they were almost completely different. Therefore, Sauron was now considering whether to advance to the Balor form first, and then to the Balor form, or directly break through the limit and enter the Balor form in one go. The former belonged to the accumulation, which should be more or less beneficial. As for the latter, the increase in strength was the most obvious. As long as he advanced to the Balor form, Sauron's combat power would immediately increase by more than 30%. He thought about it seriously. He felt that there was no enemy he could not fight against now. Maybe it would be better to advance to the Balor form first, and then to become the Balor. The battle gradually subsided. Sauron looked down at the battlefield in front of him. All the demons did not dare to look directly at him. When Sauron looked over, they all knelt down. Pick a group of captives. Galumba Arena needs to hold a grand death battle. We will send an invitation to the demons. Tell those captives. If they can kill those demons, then I will give them freedom and status. Chapter 8:13. Near a secluded valley. Victor crawled on the ground nervously. He blended into the darkness and carefully lurked in the grass. May my lord Sorin protect me. Victor kissed his emblem and then walked around the valley in front of him from the side. During this time, the confrontation between the half-elf church and the shadow thieves had never stopped. Many excellent rogues had fallen as a result. The order from the higher-ups was to find the shadow thieves' lair, and then follow the clues to find the headquarters of the shadow church. This valley was one of the most likely targets. In order to spy on this place, many of the church's best members had fallen. Before Victor, there were already 3 first-rate rogues who had gone missing here. The terrain here is very hidden. Looking at the traces nearby, it should be man-made. Victor carefully avoided a trigger trap, and then climbed in from the side wall like a gecko. He was an acrobat before he became a rogue. He knew some tricks that other rogues did not know. Sometimes in this kind of mission, people like him who had special abilities often played a role. Someone was approaching. Victor immediately held his breath. He had cast a night vision spell in advance, so he could clearly see that someone was approaching. Shadow thieves. The one in the middle? Shadow wizard. Sure enough. Even if this is not their headquarters, it's one of their strongholds. Victor's figure crawled on the wall, hesitating whether to continue to investigate. After thinking for a long time, he finally decided to retreat. If this was really the headquarters of the shadow thieves, if he went in rashly, he would probably disappear mysteriously like the previous few people. It was better to send the news back to Mordor City first and see what the higher-ups had arranged. In the dark night, Victor retreated cautiously, and before he left a special mark nearby. Mordor City. The Shadow Plane. After spending a lot of manpower and material resources, the floating space tower project of Mordor City finally came to an end. At this time, all the higher-ups of Mordor City, including Sorin, had gathered here. In front of them were Gloria and Fallen Witch, who were in charge of the experiment. The High Priest was responsible for maintaining the connection of the psionic field to avoid accidents. After all, this kind of experiment was still a bit troublesome. It consumed a lot of energy to raise a floating space tower. If it failed, it would be a small mushroom cloud. Fallen Witch's expression was a little excited and nervous. For a long time, she had devoted most of her energy to the study of the floating space city. Raising a floating space tower was the first step. As long as this step was completed, her plan to build a floating space tower would get a good start. Start of energy transmission. Fouling experiments voice, and at the same time, the elemental furnace, and temporarily cut off the energy supply to Mordor City. A cold mechanical voice, floating space ring 1, activated. Floating space ring ring, floating space ring 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 ring. The floating space tower. The ground began to tremble. Everyone looked nervously in front of them. Under the huge energy supply of the elemental furnace, the floating space rings buried under the arcane tower lit up one by one. The brilliance of magic energy lit up on countless dense runes, and then with a violent tremor, the arcane tower in front of them began to rise little by little. Finally, a piece of land about 3 kilometers in diameter rose to about 20 meters in the air. A huge pit appeared on the ground in front of them. In order to separate this piece of land, Gloria and Fallen Witch made a lot of preparations. This not only required a lot of material resources, but also the spell of mud to stone to fix the whole foundation. Originally, the progress was not so fast. But the emergence of simulacrum greatly improved this efficiency. It was mentioned earlier that simulacrum could retain 80% of the strength remembered by the original body. In the process of completing the entire foundation transformation, Gloria and Fallen Witch replaced all the spells with mud to stone, and then kept memorizing simulacrum, using the spell slots of the incarnation to complete the whole process. It took only 2 days to complete the underground layout of the entire floating space tower. The land below was not as simple as rocks. It included an elemental pool, a set of large-scale magic circuits, 3 underground laboratories, an energy balancing device, and many arranged magic circuit nodes. The entire arcane tower was only the part on the surface, and there were a lot of floating space rings and other magic devices buried underground. Liftoff complete. Activate the energy shield. The prompt of the Thaling experiment sounded again, accompanied by the appearance of a strange magic brilliance. A beam of light rose from the highest floor of the arcane tower, and then the corresponding beams of light appeared on the surrounding ground. Finally, all the magic circuits formed a node in mid-air, turning into an oval shield that wrapped the entire floating space tower from all directions. The strong wind blowing from the shadow plane disappeared. The shield was not only to provide protection, but also to balance the environment inside the entire floating space tower. Activate the magic propulsion device. Start the test. A floating space tower not only had to be able to float, but it also had to be able to fly, and the flying speed could not be too slow. The brilliance of arcane magic emerged. A brilliance appeared on the first floor of the wizard tower, and then the entire floating space tower shook slightly, and then began to move slowly to the right, gradually increasing the speed, and finally about the same as the flying speed of a wyvern. This should be the limit. After all, the volume of the floating space island is too big. If the flying speed is too fast, the consumption of the energy shield will be even greater. Gloria's voice sounded, and she said, "Everything is stable at present. The energy consumption is about 10%. With the function of the elemental furnace, it should be able to withstand it." Although it seemed to only consume 10% of the energy, this was only normal operation after all. If he entered a combat state, then the energy consumption would increase exponentially. Normally, 10% of the energy consumption would be consumed, but in a combat state, he would need at least 60%. It seemed that the limit that the elemental furnace could provide was a floating space tower. To reach the standard of a floating space city, it was still necessary to find a way to understand the mystery of elemental fission, because only in this way could a larger floating space city be supported. "Do you want to teleport back to Motor City?" Soren's voice sounded in the psychic field. After all, the shadow plane is not a long-term place. It would be best to move back to the material plane. Fallen Witch's voice sounded, "Not yet. This is just the first floating space test. We need to further test the stability of the floating space tower. And the foundation of this floating space tower has not been repaired. If it is teleported to the material plane, the landing may cause internal damage." Hearing Karina's words, Soren could not help but look at the bottom of the floating space tower. Sure enough, it had not been repaired, but it was directly separated from the ground. If it wanted to land, it must be redesigned below to ensure that the floating space tower could land in most geographical environments. It was unrealistic to float all the time. Because it consumed a lot of energy, the weight of the rising part had exceeded that of dozens of aircraft carriers. "Okay. It's up to you in this regard." Soren seemed to remember something and said, How is the research of the superconducting magical pulse cannon? Can it be copied and transferred to other places? Gloria answered him. She shook her head and said, "Not yet. We don't have enough manpower. We lack enough legendary spellcasters. It's impossible to do so many things with my mother's ability alone." This was something that could not be helped. Any research requirements during the Arcane Empire were very high, and only legendary spellcasters could meet the requirements. At present, there were only 3 people in Motor City who were qualified to research: Gloria, Fallen Witch, and Alice, a legendary puppet master. Even Soren was not qualified to do this. He spread out his hands. His alchemy skills were too low. As a true god, the master of Motor City, Soren usually had too many things to do. Moreover, there was the Shadow Lord to deal with. Alchemy was a basic skill that required a lot of time, so he had no time to practice it. Moreover, this basic skill would not directly improve his strength. He could only wait until he had free time to study it. Let's start the last step of the test. Speaking of this, Fallen Witch's voice was a little nervous, and she said slowly, "Activate the defense lock device." Buzz. The elemental furnace suddenly shook, and then it emitted a dazzling light. This meant that the energy operation was suddenly improved by a lot, and at the same time, the magnetic field around it began to become chaotic in an instant. The defense lock was activated. As one of the core structures of the floating space tower and the floating space city, it was useless to rely on an energy shield alone. It was a huge target. To really make the floating space tower powerful enough, the defense lock was one of the necessary components. The power of a domain spread. When the floating space tower's defense lock was activated, Soren suddenly had a feeling of breathing discomfort and rejection. This was the energy field of the defense lock. When the defense lock was strong enough, it could even cover the magic net, so that the people inside it could not cast spells at all. The floating space tower's defense lock was not that strong yet. However, the formation of an energy field was inevitable. As long as it was within the range of this defense lock, any enemy's ability to cast spells would be greatly reduced. This ratio was at least 30%. If the floating space tower's defense lock could be improved a little more, then it could directly seal the ability of all enemies to cast low-level spells of Circle 1 to Circle 3. In other words, once the defense lock was activated, wizards below the middle level would directly become useless. P.S. If you like this book, you can follow Fu2's public account on WeChat. Chapter 8:14. The magic lock is stable. When the cold mechanical voice of the Falling experiment sounded, everyone present could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. The magic lock was the most important part of the floating space tower because the floating space tower was connected to the war chess half-bit wall. If there was a rejection reaction, the result would be quite complicated, and the time spent would be doubled. But if there was no problem with the magic lock, a little modification could directly transfer the floating space tower to the material plane. It seems to be successful. Soren could not help but breathe a sigh of relief, then raised his hand and waved to open a door, and directly entered the war chess half-bit wall. As he obtained the highest authority inside the arcane tower, the authority of the war chess half-bit wall was also opened. Unfortunately, Soren's knowledge of arcane magic was not enough to crack the mystery of this half-bit wall. Even Gloria and the Fallen Witch could not analyze the strange ability similar to the illusion simulated by virtual reality. The entire war chess half-bit wall was a huge server array. It looked like a pyramid. The lowest level was the elemental pool of the half-bit wall, and then the corresponding level of space of a certain bit wall. The first level was earth. The second level was wind. The third level was water. The fourth level was fire. The fifth level was light. The sixth level was dark. The seventh level was the elemental pool, connected to the 4 major elemental bit wall, and at the same time maintained the passage to the upper and lower bit wall. If the half-bit wall created by Gloria was level 1, then the war chess half-bit wall was at least level 20. It had existed for thousands of years, and its area and energy had expanded to an amazing extent. In terms of the scope of space, the war chess half-bit wall was much larger than the half-bit wall controlled by the Northern Witch Council. Every level was an array. All of them were simulation games of war chess. The controller could let people's minds enter it, and then simulate a virtual reality effect with an extremely mysterious illusion. It was just like the virtual reality game before Soren's time travel. The only difference was that the former was completed through magic, while the latter was directly connected to the human nervous system and arranged by a superbrain. Of course. Seriously speaking, the war chess demiplane couldn't even compare to the virtual games of the interstellar era. First of all, the world was not big enough. Secondly, its computing power was far inferior to the super AI. It was likely that Thaling 13 was the one controlling the illusion in the half-plane of war chess. To a certain extent, Thaling could also be transformed into a supercomputer. They could be given powerful computing power to help manage the entire floating city, just like the computing power of the Divine Network. However, the demiplane of war chess had its own advantages, and that was its extreme realism. Dreamland. Soren didn't quite understand what this thing was for. It was far more realistic than the virtual reality of the star-studded era. War chess. This card deck was once all the rage during the Arcane Empire, including the card of all things, arcane cards, tarot cards, cards of fate, and so on. This series of card decks were all derived from war chess. In other words, these things used to be prizes and props in war chess games. Why did the great arcanists create something like this? Soren had been thinking about this for a long time. Was it just for entertainment? This was definitely impossible. The great arcanists wouldn't be so bored as to spend so much energy just to make a prop for entertainment. Finally, Soren thought of the most likely scenario. Experience. During the Arcane Empire, the threshold for spellcasters was quite high. Those who were qualified to become arcanists were all geniuses, that is, those who were born with extraordinary intelligence of more than 20 points. This kind of person was definitely very rare. It could be said that any loss was difficult to make up for in a short time. People who were born with intelligence of 20 points were not just 1 in 10,000, but for the entire civilization of the Arcane Empire, ordinary spellcasters were not of much value at all. Only those who were born with intelligence of more than 20 points were likely to become great arcanists. Only then could they inherit and strengthen the power of the Arcane Empire. Then, how could these geniuses improve their strength? Let them take risks like other ordinary professions? What if he died before he was done with his training? If such a person died, where could they find another one? The purpose of the great arcanists creating the war chess game was to provide them with the most basic platform, so that they could face all kinds of death threats without dying to train their strength and wisdom. To be honest, so far, there were only 2 people around Soren who might be born with extraordinary intelligence. One was Gloria. The other was Fallen Witch. Now both of them were legendary witches, and there was almost no one else who had such talent. One could imagine how rare it was to have the talent of a great arcanist at that time. If there were no accidents, they could basically become legendary spellcasters. Of course. The purpose of the war chess game was not only to train the arcanists, but also to other professions who were born with extraordinary intelligence. For example, Lulu. The speed of her strength improvement was frightening. Now she was not yet an adult, but she was already a high-grade profession. It could be said that she would definitely be a legendary profession when she grew up. This was the most likely use of the war chess demiplane that Soren could think of. Otherwise, he really couldn't think of any other uses for the war chess demiplane. A large-scale entertainment game? This was not impossible. The combat power of the people in the Arcane Empire was very high. Maybe it had something to do with this war chess game. It just provided a platform, and it would not give any ability. Anyone who entered the war chess demiplane would rely on their own skills to fight. Without combat skills and strength, it would be a dead end. Soren's current idea was whether he could use the war chess demiplane to train the group of people with the best potential in Mordor City. He was someone who had personally experienced the war chest demiplane, and he knew how useful this thing was. It was absolutely more useful for a person's combat potential and skill training than usual. After all, a person could not always face the threat of death, and there were not many people who could survive such a situation in reality. However, the war chest demiplane only affected the mind slightly. Of course. In fact, it still affected the soul a little. After Soren mastered the war chest demiplane, he found that the death of the trial inside would cause a loss of soul power. But it was very little. In terms of data, it was about a reduction of about 1000 slaughter exp. This trace of soul power was absorbed by the war chest demiplane and then transformed into the magic circle. Soren felt that the intelligence of the virtual character inside was related to a trace of soul power that was stripped off when the character died. What was the mystery behind it? With Soren's current knowledge, it was not enough to crack it. Because this was the field of arcane magic, not the field of gods. But one thing that Soren could be sure of was that the research during the Arcane Empire had already begun to involve the field of soul. No wonder the gods were not so friendly to the Arcane Empire. How should I use this thing? Soren looked at the war chest demiplane in front of him and fell into deep thought. To be honest, this thing could be used in many ways. First of all, Mordor City had a large number of outstanding talents who were facing a breakthrough, such as Lulu, Ugly Monkey, Jack, Scarface, Cyclops, and Giant, who had already broken through the legendary realm. What these people lacked was a more extreme kind of training. For strong people like them, losing about 1000 slaughter exp was not a problem at all. If it could be exchanged for a chance to face death, it was definitely worth it. They were the first targets that Soren considered. Then there was the group of people near the middle of Mordor City. Many excellent officers could also be trained. Finally, it was the ordinary people and low-grade professions. These people might not be able to enter it for the time being. Ordinary people who had their soul power extracted equivalent to 1000 slaughter exp would be bedridden for more than 3 months. If the low-grade professions died a few times, they might face the danger of losing a level. In other words, this thing was provided for professions, and they must be strong, determined, and have enough potential. Otherwise, if they died in the illusion, their body would really die. There was no other way. The war chess game was too realistic. There is no way to promote it in a short time. Soren looked at the elemental pool at the bottom and murmured, but we can test it a little at the moment. Let's see if the trial of the war chess demiplane has any effect on those talented people. But we can't test it continuously. Let's choose a few excellent targets and see how it works. After Soren died in it, he felt a little uncomfortable mentally. One thing for sure was that this thing had side effects, and the side effects would be very serious for ordinary people. The specific effect still needed to be tested. Soren had a lot of things along the way, and it would take a lot of time to study the war chest demiplane. However, the potential of this thing was unpredictable. If it could really reduce the side effects, maybe Mordor City could mass-produce a group of elite troops who dared to face death. To some extent, the Arcane Empire was really similar to the Interstellar era. Because when this virtual reality technology was first researched, the first application was to train super soldiers. It was just that one used the technology tree, and the other used alchemy. Mordor City. The Great Temple. When Soren returned to the Great Temple, the High Priest was already waiting there. "My lord." The High Priest bowed slightly and said softly, "The divine artifact mithril chain mail is a little troublesome. I'm afraid I can't complete it in a short time. I need to study the psionic imprint on it." Greybeard should have obtained some knowledge about the psychic empire. "I need to understand these special psionic imprints first." Soren nodded and said, "It's okay. You can study this thing first. I don't need it for the time being." The biggest enemy at the moment was the Shadow Lord. Soren had prepared a big gift for him. To deal with him, Soren had a super meat shield in front of him. It didn't matter if he wore the divine artifact mithril chain mail or not. Ascendant, Eugene. This was a super meat shield in the material plane. Chapter 8:15. Outer Islands. Motor City. As soon as Soren returned to the Great Temple, the bishop in charge of the South Coast region sent back a piece of good news. They found the Shadow Thief's lair. But the good news was accompanied by bad news. The rogues sent by Soren also found the followers of the Lady of the Night, greater divine power. The Lady of the Night was one of the oldest evil gods. Although she had cooperated with the Lord of Shadows, that was before the Avatar crisis. The Lady of the Night wanted to seize the Shadow priesthood to further strengthen her power. Because she originally had the priesthood of the night, if she could seize the Shadow priesthood, then the power of the Lady of the Night would become very terrible. The emblem of the Lady of the Night was very recognizable, a purple ring wrapped around a black disc. Another point that must be mentioned was that the kingdom of the Lady of the Night was also in the Shadow plane, but it was an independent kingdom called the Shadow Realm. The mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the aureole behind. Soren gently put down the information in his hand, and there was a mocking expression on his face. If the Lord of Shadows was the mantis, then the Lady of the Night was naturally the aureole, and Soren, as a new god, naturally looked like the cicada caught in the trap. This also proved why the Lord of Shadows had been able to hold back from attacking Soren personally until now, because there was a Lady of the Night behind him, waiting for the Lord of Shadows to reveal himself. However, the Avatar crisis was the most chaotic period. Although the Lady of the Night was staring at the Lord of Shadows, other great gods in the righteous camp were also watching her. Especially the Lord of Light, he had always believed that the Lady of the Night was one of the root causes of evil. Now it's a situation of multi-party game. Soren slowly put down the information in his hand and murmured, "At this time, no one dares to act rashly. But such a situation is also suitable for fishing in troubled waters. If you want to get the greatest benefits, you have to rely on your own means." However, now that the Lord of Shadows had revealed himself, Soren naturally had to take the initiative to attack. He immediately sent a magic message to Arendelle. "The prey has appeared." Soren inherited part of the priesthood of the god of the hunt, Malor. To some extent, he was also a hunter. Although there were traces of the Lord of Shadows, he still had to think about the specific action of action. Soren wanted to muddy the waters. Only when the water of the water was muddy the waters would not pay too much attention to the other gods. This could not be helped. Soren first killed the demigod vampire, and then killed the god of the hunt, Malor. Now, even the Shadow Lord died in his hands. Of the gods, Shadow God. Although many gods had fallen during the Avatar crisis, it was still the early stage after all. Not a single god with mid-level divine power had died yet. His actions now could easily attract the attention of the other old gods. According to the original history of the Avatar crisis, there would be a conflict between the old gods in about 3 or 4 months. In particular, the return of the orc god system would lead to the fall of a group of gods with mid-level divine powers. If Soren killed the Lord of Shadows at this time, it would attract a lot less attention. It had to be said. There were benefits to the goddess of magic being alive, but it was also because she was still alive that all the gods with great divine power were more restrained at present. The Lady of Silvermoon had not recovered her power, so naturally, she had not started her revenge. The sequence of history would probably have to wait until the second wave of impact of the return of the orc god system. According to the track of history, the orc god system finally began to return to the material plane after thousands of years of silence, and the orc god reappeared in the eyes of the world. The orcs were not natives of the material plane. They came from other planes and spaces. Many races in the material plane were not natives, including beholders, mind flayers, lizard men, and so on. It was common for foreign races to eventually settle in the material plane. Most of the orcs were in another semi-material plane. Astral world exploration. At the beginning, the Arcane Empire vigorously developed the resources of the astral world for the purpose of finding other suitable planes and spaces for survival. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. Soren was always paying attention to the movements of the Lord of Shadows, and as March gradually passed, various news began to come from the Orc kingdom. First of all, it was that the Orc army seemed to have a fight with the dwarves over a piece of land with rich mines. But this was just the beginning. The outside world was still wondering why the Orcs, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly moved, and then they continued to have conflicts with other races. The second race that broke out in conflict was the Prairie Elves. Although the Orcs were an agricultural civilization, there were many nomadic clans inside. The conflict broke out because of the prairie land. The two sides directly confronted each other, and it seemed that the Orcs had the upper hand. This time, the outside world finally couldn't sit still. For a long time, the Orcs had not been the most powerful race in the material plane. Although the most populous race included the Orcs, humans, elves, and dwarves still had a huge advantage. The population of the Orcs was only 1/20th of that of humans, 1/4 of that of elves, and about 1/2 of that of dwarves. Since the silence of the Orc god system, the entire race had been quite low-key. Now that they suddenly became so high-profile, it immediately attracted a lot of attention in the material plane. In particular, the kingdom of the god of hunting had recently fallen near the Orc territory. It was about the 5th day. A news suddenly spread to the high-level figures in the material plane. An organization went deep into the Orc kingdom to spy, and finally they found a huge portal. Soren's news was sent by the Northern Witch Council. The Eye of the North personally sent him a magic message, which recorded the changes that had happened in the Orc kingdom. They had built a huge portal. This portal was larger than any portal in the material plane. Looking at the entire material plane, perhaps only the ancient Amaska Empire had built such a portal. In order to capture slaves, the Amaska Empire did not hesitate to use the portal to break the plane barrier and directly capture slaves from another world. The Orcs also appeared in the material plane at that time. At that time, the Amaska Empire's act of capturing slaves directly angered two powerful god systems from other planes. The gods and saints fought in the mortal world, which directly led to the beginning of the destruction of an ancient and glorious empire. In the message sent by the Eye of the North, it was directly pointed out that this portal might be related to the portal of the Amaska Empire. This portal directly led to another world, which was very likely to be the plane where the Orcs were born. The Orc god system finally couldn't help but make a move. Soren slowly put down the information in his hand and murmured, "Is Grumsh going to take revenge by using the Avatar Crisis?" Grumsh was the main god of the Orc god system. He hated all gods and species that were not Orcs. He was a standard racist, and in the War of the Orcs, he fought head-on with the god system of the material plane. Unfortunately, he lost at that time. Moreover, the main god of the Orcs lost an eye because of this. It was said that it was taken away by the main god of the Elves, Corellon. The Orc god system was cruel and wild. They believed that the weak had no value. Even within the Orcs, the strong could blatantly take away the land and wealth of the weak. Back then, when this portal opened, it was jokingly called the Door of Darkness by the adventurers. The main reason was that it symbolized that the Orcs had officially begun to invade the material plane. After resting in silence for thousands of years, the Orc god system was ready to face the gods of the material plane head-on again. The fiasco of the Amaska Empire had always been a shame to the Orc god system. The Orcs in the material plane today were basically the descendants of the Orc slaves that were captured from the portal to another world. If this portal was really opened, then it was very likely that the Orc god system would directly send troops from the original plane where the Orcs were born. A powerful Orc army from another world. This armed force would directly change the structure of the material plane. It would also allow the Orcs, who had always been weak to other races, to suddenly have the ability to challenge humans, elves, and dwarves. What will come after all. Soren could not help but sigh. He found that some historical tracks of the Avatar Crisis could not be changed, since the Orc god system had already appeared. Then the third major event should be happening soon. The Battle of the Twin of Destiny. The disaster of the Avatar Crisis was escalating step by step. The demon invasion of the Abyss was just an appetizer. The Battle of the Gods was the main show. When the Lord of Hell, Asmodeus, also appeared, the critical moment that really determined the future of the multiverse had arrived. The time was April. Soren was not sure whether it was early April or mid-April. For a long time, the twin of destiny, the goddess of fortune, and the goddess of misfortune, who had been traveling outside the world and the gods, had finally appeared. They would have their first confrontation in April. At the same time, there would also be 3 lucky gold coins during this period, and a card of destiny would be born. Thinking of this, Soren suddenly could not help but have a headache. The war of the orcs had nothing to do with him. Even if the orc god system and the elf god system fought, he could also watch the fire burning across the river. But the battle between the goddess of fortune and the goddess of misfortune had something to do with him. Because Soren had the blessing of the goddess of misfortune, it was hard to say what the goddess of fortune would think of him. Maybe he would have no luck in this life. The War of the Orcs. The main god of the orcs, Grumsh, and the main god of the elves, Corellon, had a head-on confrontation. Some gods on both sides died, and the conflict between the material planes directly escalated. The Queen of Spiders wanted to fish in troubled waters, and the movements of the Lady of Night were also very concerned about this. This was Soren's opportunity. When the battle between the orc god system and the elf god system broke out, it was also the time for him to deal with the Shadow Lord. Because at that time, no one would have the energy to pay too much attention to him. Chapter 8:16. Be lenient if you confess, be strict if you resist. The reason why I didn't update is that I went to the healthcare center to relax. 2:33, the sun shone on the quiet city of Mordor. Jack greeted his sister early in the morning, then packed his things and prepared to report to the barracks. He was now a middle-ranking officer in Mordor City, and his promotion speed was far faster than other colleagues. Of course, one reason was that his original strength was not bad. But another reason was his little nephew. This little guy, who was only 1.5 years old this year, was accepted as a disciple by an archbishop of Mordor City. In the future, he would almost certainly sit in one of the 12 seats inside the half-elf church. Under the high priest, there were a total of 12 seats in the half-elf church, which belonged to the central administration, the judiciary, and the bishops. Jack's nephew was almost certain to be one of the future archbishops. Nowadays, his little nephew spent most of his time in the temple receiving the glory baptism of Lord Soren. Every day, the archbishop would hold a special prayer ceremony for him. He spent Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in the temple, while Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday were raised by his sister at home. Every Sunday's large prayer, Jack's little nephew would show up almost every time. Many people in Mordor City already knew that he was one of the successors of the archbishop. The little guy was very precocious. Sometimes Jack would feel a little nervous when he looked at him. Especially when he looked at Jack and his sister, Jack always felt a little guilty. Recently, his sister had been hoping that he could find a girl to marry. She even gave an example of the love between a drow instructor and a half-elf girl, but Jack always refused with the excuse of being busy with official business. Mordor City was always busy. Because there were always a lot of things that would be announced in the city hall, the whole city of Mordor was a high-speed machine. Some of the orders came from the highest level of Mordor City, that was, the Great Soren. Another part of the orders came from the Council of Mordor City. After such a long time, the officials finally began to adapt to the current system. They not only carried out orders, but they also began to learn to think and issue decrees in the way of Soren. For example, the recent trade reform in Mordor City was discussed by the council and then reported to the higher-ups. As usual, the first place Jack rushed to was the barracks. Recently, the higher-ups of Mordor City had plans to send troops to the outside world. Many officers were eager to give it a try, and Jack was also one of the young people who took the initiative to volunteer. Sir Soren is the Pirate King. However, he was not an ordinary Pirate King. He had almost single-handedly established a kingdom in the Outer Islands. Therefore, the army of Mordor was divided into 2 camps. One was the old pirate leader camp. Almost all of them were assigned to manage overseas territories for Soren. The other was the military camp of Mordor City. There were more elites in this camp, and they were all newly promoted young people. Jack, like many of his colleagues, hoped to obtain a position that was not inferior to the other pirate leaders. If you want to improve your status in Mordor City, the simplest and most direct way is to get military merits. As soon as he arrived near the barracks, Jack suddenly heard cries of surprise coming from all around, followed by a commotion. He could faintly hear the sound of the guards quickly gathering. What happened? Jack saw that the others couldn't help but look up at the sky in horror. He quickly followed suit and looked up. What he saw made him suck in a breath of cold air. A huge tower appeared over the city of Mordor. The huge shadow almost completely covered the central square. With the sharp alarm, the guards of Mordor City quickly gathered. However, even if they had seen too many new things, when a floating space tower appeared over Mordor City, they were still shocked. Many people could not help but feel shocked and a little scared. This was a wizard's tower. God knows how terrible its lethality was. The material plane had been in awe of spellcasters for thousands of years. Ordinary soldiers were already a little scared when they saw this arcane tower. Prepare for battle. Send someone to inform Sir Gloria. An unknown tower suddenly appeared in Mordor City. Send the news immediately. A bearded officer rushed out. Although there was a trace of fear in his eyes, he still led the soldiers to gather. However, at this time, the figure of the high priest appeared, and then the figure of Gloria also appeared in the air. The situation is smoother than we thought. Gloria looked down at the panicked residents of Mordor City under her feet and said slowly, "The first teleportation was successful. Mother, you are going to move the tower to the south of Mordor City." After that, Gloria slowly lowered her height and said to the other surprised people in a gentle voice, "This is the tower that belongs to the city of Mordor. But it was not completed until today. You don't have to panic, all of you can leave." Mordor City? The Tower of Mordor City? When did Mordor City have a wizard tower? Jack's brain couldn't wrap itself around it for a while, but he quickly reacted. He didn't know the news from the upper level of Mordor City. He didn't know when a tower was built in Mordor City. But soon, a trace of excitement and joy appeared on his face. After all, this was a wizard tower, and the combat power of a wizard tower was top-notch. Mordor City now had a wizard tower, which was almost unbreakable. Even if the Devil Legion came again, there was no need to worry. And it was a freaking flying adept's tower. They had never heard of it before. Even a wizard tower could fly. How many powerful secret cards did the upper level of Mordor City have? The crowd was completely excited. Many people were looking at the tower in the sky with excitement, curiosity, and awe. The wizard tower was flying slowly, gradually approaching the south of Mordor City. At the same time, those spies who were secretly lurking in Mordor City, or were friendly, or were observing, or had bad intentions, were all frightened at this moment. Wizard Tower. This alone was not enough to scare them, because there were many legendary spellcasters who had towers in the material plane, but there was no one who had a flying floating space tower so far. Floating Space City. People with active minds immediately thought of this. Had Mordor City mastered some technology of the floating space city? The Temple of Wealth. The tall gold priest was immediately alarmed. She had been responsible for the management of the temple in Port Mordor. When the floating space tower appeared, she was alarmed. But when she saw the floating space tower with her own eyes, there was still a trace of uncontrollable horror on her face, and she immediately said, "Send the news back to the City of Wealth immediately. Mordor City must have mastered some cutting-edge alchemy from the Arcane Empire. Report to the Archbishop. We must establish a stronger alliance with Mordor City before others." Golem Legion. Floating Space Tower. The two most critical parts of Mordor City were now there. God knew when the whole city would be floating. If that was the case, Mordor City might become the most powerful force in the material plane. It was not only the Temple of Wealth that was full of horror, but also the Temple of Sea. They immediately began to report to the church's upper level. Other forces reacted even more quickly, especially the members of the Northern Witch Council. The witches who did not join Mordor City were a little annoyed, but they quickly sent the news back to the north. And those who joined Mordor City were very excited because Mordor City even had a floating space tower. It was conceivable that the upper level must have other top knowledge. And it was possible for them to learn all of this knowledge. For the sudden appearance of the floating space tower in Mordor City, the three places that responded the fastest were the Northern Witch Council, the Wizard Alliance, and the last was Arendelle. Soren received a magic message from Arendelle almost on the same day. Princess Royal left him a message. "I'll be there tomorrow." Soren did not reveal much about the research progress of Mordor City, but Princess Royal still knew a little about it. After all, the relationship between the two sides was quite close. Arendelle had powerful ice witches and had built several wizard towers. The appearance of the floating space tower was an irresistible knowledge for Princess Royal. She was very eager to get other mysteries and use them to improve the strength of Arendelle. Of course, there was no free lunch in the world. Although Soren and Princess Anna had a close relationship, and he also had a good friendship with Princess Royal, when it came to such top knowledge, the other party must pay a price. The situation was turbulent. Soren had already expected the appearance of the floating space tower. The elder princess and the Eye of the North informed him almost immediately that they would come back to visit, and the representative of the wizard city also arrived in Mordor the next day. They were also eager to get the internal knowledge of the floating space tower. But this kind of top alchemy knowledge could not be handed out casually. These people must pay the corresponding price. What do you think? Soren turned and glanced at Gloria, then glanced at the fallen witch and said, "The appearance of the floating space tower has alarmed them. We can't refuse all of them. How should we deal with them?" Gloria pondered for a moment, and then did not hesitate to sell out the Northern Witch Council. She said, "The Northern Witch Council has a fragment of the Silver Blade of Gith. It can be used to complete your artifact. There is also some knowledge about the magic lock and energy transmission. These are one of the conditions of the exchange. I'm not very clear about the Wizard Alliance. But they must hand over the energy shield technology they have mastered. Arcane puppets and arcane guards are far more powerful than golem puppets. To get the knowledge of the floating space tower, they must take out these things in exchange. And about the extra-dimensional fortress, my mother and I are very interested in it. The Wizard City must give us permission to explore it. As for the Princess Royal." Speaking of this, Gloria could not help but glance at Soren and said, "I don't want to get involved in her affairs. You can do as you see fit." Hearing Gloria's words, Soren's expression suddenly became a little more awkward. Chapter 8:17. The city of Mordor suddenly became lively. Since the appearance of the floating island, the floating population of the city of Mordor had suddenly increased by 30%. Not only were there members from the Northern Witch Council, but there were also members from the more distant Wizard Kingdom, as well as the Arendelle Ice Witches who had just arrived this morning. In addition, there were many spies from other forces in the port of Mordor. Even Mrs. Rossard, the Duke of Red Dragon, who had fought with Soren, secretly sent people to sneak into the city of Mordor to spy. However, these spies were wiped out by the rogues of the Judicial Department as soon as they entered the city of Mordor. The Floating City. For a long time, many spellcasters had never given up on the study of the Floating City. The appearance of the floating island in the city of Mordor directly led to many wizards preparing to visit the city. Even in just one day, many members from the Northern Witch Council secretly proposed to Gloria that they were willing to be her subordinates. Ordinary people could not imagine the spellcaster's desire for this cutting-edge alchemy. Looking at how easily the puppet master girl was taken back by Soren, it could be seen how amazing the temptation of the floating city was to them. Because there were too many people coming at once, Soren had no choice but to receive them separately. He was responsible for receiving the ice witches brought by Princess Royal Arendelle, while Gloria was responsible for receiving Her Excellency Eye of the North, who was directly teleported over. As for the fallen witch, she was responsible for negotiating with the representatives of the Wizard Alliance. The existence of the floating island could not be hidden at present, and part of the alchemy knowledge could be exchanged. The key was whether they were willing to pay the corresponding price. Of course. What Soren was willing to take out was only the superficial things of the floating space tower. The content was limited to the floating ring. As for the core, elemental furnace, Soren would never hand it over. The energy supply of the floating space tower could be provided by manpower, magic circles, elemental pool, half-bit wall, and so on. The specific extent still depended on the amount of energy provided. Relying on the elemental pool and the demi-plane, the most they could do was float in the air. It was like a car that had $100 worth of gas. It could run for a while, but once it ran out, it could only start again after the elemental pool was fully charged. The biggest role of the elemental furnace was to provide long-lasting endurance and maximized energy supply. As long as Soren grasped this, he was not afraid that other forces would make a floating space tower, because their floating space towers could not fly far. This is it. The witches of Arendelle were placed in the station in the city of Moder. This time, Soren took the elder princess to visit the floating space tower in person. Compared to the last time they met, she had become more beautiful elemental light. But at the same time, she had become colder and colder, giving people the illusion that winter would come if they got close to her. This was the power of the gods. Princess Royal was integrating the power of the goddess of the north wind and snow, little by little. Although she had yet to truly ascend to godhood, she already had the illusion that she was as cold as a deity and treated all living things like ants. Perhaps only the people she cared about the most would be able to make the Princess Royal show human emotions. In contrast, Sauron's body had the smell of a mortal. Even if he was already a true god. The core of the floating space tower is 3 parts, the elemental furnace, the floating space ring, and the half-bit wall. Soren glanced at Princess Royal, who had a cold expression. With the integration of the power of the clergy, Princess Royal's expression changed less and less. Her delicate and beautiful face was like ice that would never melt. If she could not find herself in the struggle with divinity and clergy, then she would eventually become like other gods. Eventually, she would be interfered with by the clergy. She would be as emotionless and merciless as the winter. Soren could not help her with this. Everything could only rely on Princess Royal herself. If she did not overcome the interference of the clergy and divinity, she would inevitably embark on such a path. For example, the King of the Dead was almost completely kidnapped by his clergy. Well. Princess Royal nodded gently, glanced around, and said slowly, "Where is the elemental furnace? Is it the key to the operation of the floating space tower?" Soren smiled and said, "The elemental furnace, as the core, naturally cannot be placed in the open. It has been moved to the innermost part of the floating space tower. The Northern Witch Council and the Wizard Alliance have both sent people over. The energy part can rely on the elemental pool and the half-bit wall. Only you know about the elemental furnace." Princess Royal's expression changed slightly when she heard that, and then she said, "Can you take me to see it?" Soren immediately agreed. Then, he waved his hand and opened a portal that led directly to a small space inside the floating space tower. The huge elemental furnace was in it. Incredible. Princess Royal's eyes flashed with the brilliance of divinity. She seemed to want to analyze the principle of the elemental furnace, but after looking at it for a while, she gave up and said slowly, "The alchemy knowledge involved in it is too profound. I can't understand it yet." Soren was not surprised. Because he himself could not fully understand it. At present, in Moder City, only Gloria and Fallen Witch could understand it. The elemental furnace can be replaced with the half-bit wall. It is not difficult for you to open up a huge elemental pool with your ability. You can also achieve a similar effect with the power of the gods. Soren hesitated for a moment and said, "But in this case, you will have to pay a lot of divine power points." Princess Royal heard this and thought for a moment, then she said softly, don't worry about divine power. I have more than enough divine power now. I want the structure diagram of the floating ring, the layout diagram of the energy shield, the node structure diagram of the energy transmission, and the information related to the labyrinth. After looking around the floating space tower, Princess Royal did not mean to be polite at all. She directly asked for the most important information except for the elemental furnace. After all, her relationship with Soren was not ordinary. There was no need to beat around the bush like other forces. Soren did not hesitate too much and agreed on the spot. I can give it to you tomorrow. Very good. Princess Royal smiled when she heard that. She seemed to be in a good mood. She said playfully, these things are the betrothal gifts for Anna. Betrothal gifts? What the hell was this? Soren was stunned when he heard that. The first reaction in his mind was that Princess Royal did not object to his relationship with Princess Anna. Then, the eldest princess actually mentioned the word betrothal gift? Was she planning to marry Princess Anna to him? No. Things could not be that simple. Soren's thoughts were running fast for a moment. The next moment, he guessed the problem. So. Soren raised his head and took a deep look at Princess Royal. He said slowly, are you going to be apatheicized? Princess Royal nodded calmly. Sure enough. The corner of Soren's mouth could not help but reveal a wry smile. Was it because of this that the elder princess spoke? Princess Royal was going to be apatheicized. Then naturally, she could not always be in charge of the royal power of Arendelle. As a god, there were almost no men in the entire material plane that could catch her eye. It was almost impossible for her to have offspring with a man. In that case, the royal power of Arendelle must be passed down by Princess Anna, the first successor. Since Princess Anna was just a mortal, then she must have offspring with a man to inherit the royal power of Arendelle. Then this man could not be anyone else except Soren. Princess Royal was already preparing for the funeral. Bah bah bah. It should be said that Princess Royal had already begun to prepare for the secular affairs after she was apatheicized. Even if this situation continued, the time of her passing on the throne to Princess Anna might be brought forward. Gods could not interfere too much with the secular world. Even a god like Soren, who had the domain of rule, was limited in his interference with the secular world. For example, Soren now handed over most of the secular affairs to the Council of Mordor City to deal with. He was only in charge of the general direction and did not participate in the specific things at all. If the gods were too involved in the secular affairs, they would definitely be backfired in the future. After all, Mordor City was just a new force. There were fewer internal entanglements, so it was not a big deal to manage it a little. But for an old kingdom like Arendelle, if Princess Royal continued to be personally involved in the secular world after apatheicized, it would definitely be harmful. If Princess Royal wanted to be apatheicized, she had to give up the royal power. Soren was also on the same path as her. Looking at the situation of Mordor City today, you could understand his next arrangement. Gloria was the mistress of Mordor City. Since Soren became a god, many of the affairs of Mordor City were handled by Gloria. Not only Gloria understood this, but even many of the higher-ups of Mordor City understood this. Otherwise, why would they be so determined to support Gloria's control of Mordor City? This was how Sauron, as a god, gradually went from being on the stage to being off the stage. In the future, his core would be transferred to the half-elf church, and Gloria would also become the Lord of Mordor City at the right time. Soren would return to the dark side. As a god, he took charge of Mordor City through this means to avoid something similar to the law of cause and effect, from interfering with his rules as a true god. Under normal circumstances, the weaker the god, the more he interfered with the secular world. When it came to the level of the Lord of Light, it could be said that he did not even care about the internal affairs of the church. As for existences like the ancient god of death, Jurgel, it didn't even matter if there was a church or not. This was the case with some of the gods' rules. When Soren first became a god, the church and Mordor City were both under his control. But now he was a lesser divine power, Mordor City was almost out of his control. He just set a general direction, and almost all the internal affairs of the half-elf church were handed over to the high priest. Soren's interference with the secular world was also reducing little by little. In the end, his existence must be as high and mighty as other gods. Princess Royal was so eager to give up the royal power. The only explanation was that she was going to become a god soon, and it was very likely that she would be a lesser divine power. She had to get rid of the relationship with the secular world and directly become the snow goddess that had widespread faith in all cold areas except for Arendelle. P.S. There is one more update today. The website is getting worse. Chapter 8:18. There was a dark red color in the turbid sea. There were many dead fish floating on the nearby sea. They were basically poisoned to death. The bodies of the Nagas could be seen further away. In addition, there were many very ferocious devil fish. Obviously, there had just been a war here, but the two sides of the war were not the races on land, but the Nagas and other marine creatures that lived in the sea. Many of them were marine creatures that were rarely seen in the material plane, including the deep-sea lurkers that could only be seen in the bottomless abyss. It's the believers of Dagon. A half-elf priest looked at the sea with a serious expression, and then said to the followers behind him, "Send the news back to Mordor City immediately. It seems that the Sea Temple has started a war with the demon lord, Dagon." The Battle of the Deep Sea had broken out. After accumulating power for so long, the demon lord, Dagon, finally couldn't help but challenge the sea goddess. He himself was the demon Orbis who ruled the deep sea. If he wanted to seize the authority of the sea in the material plane, the sea goddess was an enemy that Dagon could not avoid. It could be said that it would be difficult for Dagon to extend his tentacles into the material plane without completely defeating the sea goddess. Outer Islands, Mordor City. As March gradually came to an end, the impact of the Avatar crisis struck again. Soren frowned as he looked at the information that was sent back in front of him and murmured, "Has it really started? Then I'm afraid we have to prepare to deal with the Shadow Lord." There was a lot of information sent back. First of all, the orcs finally fought with the prairie elves and won a big victory, seizing a large area of land in one fell swoop. The prairie elves were now forced to move to the forest area. It was said that the wood elves were very dissatisfied with the orcs' instigation of the war. On the other hand, the sea goddess was fighting with the demon lord, Dagon. The Nagas had confirmed that there was a serious conflict with the devil fish. There should be a huge portal somewhere in the deep sea connected to the bottomless abyss because many devil fish came from the Shadow Sea on the 89th floor of the bottomless abyss. This kind of thing must be left to the Nagas and the Sea Temple. Soren could only help them at most. The struggle at the bottom of the sea would not affect the structure of the material plane. Of course. At present, the most important news was related to the Shadow Lord. The reason why Soren felt that it was almost time to make a move was also related to the recent changes in the Church of another god. The God of Light. The Church of the God of Light had been mobilizing frequently recently, and there was a vague plan to go to war with the Church of the Lady of Night. A great divine power of the good alignment. A great god of the evil faction. Furthermore, they were both prejudiced against each other, and their hatred for each other had accumulated over the years. If the God of Light was really going to attack the Lady of the Night, then Soren's last concern would be gone. Basically, he did not have to worry about the Lady of the Night for the time being. Faced with a god like the God of Light, even the Lady of the Night would have a headache. This was the best opportunity. The Queen of Spiders' attention was currently focused on the elf god system. Once she dealt with the elf god system, which she hated the most, she would turn her attention to other gods. The Lady of the Night was now preoccupied by the God of Light and had no energy to pay attention to the Lord of Shadows. If Soren were to make a move now, he would not have to worry about the interference of powerful enemies. Of course, one of the more important reasons was that it was said that traces of the Goddess of Fortune had appeared in the northern part of the continent. The Goddess of Misfortune and the Goddess of Fortune. These two twins of destiny, who were beyond the gods, had finally appeared. Their struggle would affect the nerves of many gods, because the Avatar crisis itself was a torrent of fate. Things in Mordor were on the right track. Now negotiations and cooperation with the Northern Witch Council were slowly progressing. The Wizard Alliance also needed to discuss with the Archmages of the Council. The requirements put forward by Mordor were not low, and they might not be able to agree in a short time. With Gloria and Fallen Witch, Soren did not have to worry about the instability of his own rear. Before the Devils officially started, he felt that he still needed to find an opportunity to improve his strength. If he could advance to intermediate divine power, Soren would not have to be afraid even in the face of the old gods. And if he succeeded in killing the Lord of Shadows, then Soren's plan to establish his own divine system would begin. A divine system. The half-elf clergy must be separated from the main clergy after obtaining the shadow clergy. Soren had more long-term arrangements for these things. In a hidden basement, Uhtred walked in a hurry. Behind him were 3 cold-looking rogues. At first glance, they were specially trained assassins. Bishop. A cold female voice appeared in the darkness. Although a woman with a rather beautiful appearance but a hideous scar on the side of her face appeared, she slowly said, "The recent movements in Mordor are abnormal. I'm worried that our whereabouts have been exposed." Had he been exposed? Uhtred's face turned ugly when he thought of this, and he slowly said, "What about the news inside the church? Haven't the support of the Shadow Church been sent yet? Damn Mordor City." God knew that this opponent was so difficult to deal with. Originally, the Lord of Shadows was an intermediate divine power, and Soren was only a lesser divine power. One church had developed for thousands of years, and the other church had just been established recently. At the beginning of the operation, Uhtred thought it was just an entertainment to beat up children. But when the real battle started, he found that the enemy was much more difficult to deal with than he imagined. Soren was a new god, that was true. But after all, he inherited the original half-elf church, and he almost emptied the foundation of Autumnfall. The foundation of the entire Autumnfall was absorbed by Mordor City. The power inside the church was actually stronger than the outside world imagined. More importantly, Soren still had the power of the secular world. Most of the churches of the gods were independent of the secular world. That was to say, the Lord of Shadows did not control any kingdom. He only developed the church through his own influence in the material plane. At best, he secretly controlled some cities through the Shadow Thieves. But these cities could not be compared with Mordor City. Soren could mobilize tens of thousands of warriors with a wave of his hand, but the entire Shadow Church could not even mobilize 1/10 of the warriors of Mordor City. If it was about believers, the Lord of Shadows definitely had more than Soren. But believers were not equal to combat power. Only professionals could fight in the entire Shadow Church, and they must be devout believers. Those who believed in Pantheon may not be willing to risk their lives. But Mordor City did not have such concerns, because the army of Mordor City all obeyed Soren's orders. At first, there was no doubt that the Lord of Shadows had a clear advantage, but after the battle broke out in Shipwreck Bay, the situation had been completely reversed. The professions sent by Mordor City to fight against the Shadow Thieves and the Shadow Church were endless. Some of them were not believers of the church at all, but pirates who had been famous for a long time. After the battle entered a tug of war, it began to be unfavorable for the Shadow Church. Because the Shadow Church was facing the interest groups of the entire island of Mordor. Does the Lord have an oracle? Uhtred was silent for a moment, then suddenly said, "Where are the Shadow Thieves? Why haven't they arrived yet?" The woman standing in front of him shook her head. Suddenly, there was a strange noise outside, and a faint muffled sound came. The next moment, Uhtred's face changed greatly, and he panicked. "Something's wrong. There's an enemy." As soon as his voice fell, there was a sound of fighting outside the basement door. Uhtred rushed out almost immediately. This was a sealed basement. If he was surrounded inside, there was nowhere to run. Uhtred rushed out quickly. But before he could make a move, a dagger had already pierced through his back. "Ezer? You?" The woman with a scar on the side of her face took back her weapon with a cold expression. After a cold look, she slowly lifted the spell on her body and said sarcastically, "I'm not Ezer." Her appearance gradually changed. The most obvious feature was that her height suddenly increased a lot, then her eyebrows became much colder, and finally her ears became slightly pointed. Half-elf. Greater transformation. The half-elf assassin named Ezer waved his hand and cut Uhtred's throat, then slowly said, "The Ezer you're talking about is already dead. Otherwise, I really can't find your secret stronghold." Northern Witch Council. At the last moment of his life, Uhtred suddenly understood in his mind. Such an exquisite transformation spell was not something that ordinary people could use. The Northern Witch Council was behind the city of Mordor, and only the high-level members of the Northern Witch Council could make her look like Ezer, and he had never noticed this. Wizard. Damned adepts. Although there were also wizards inside the Shadow Church, there was no way to compete with such an old witch force. Most of them were rogues, followed by priests who served the gods, and finally shadow wizards who changed their professions. Life gradually faded away. The woman who turned into Ezer glanced at the corpse on the ground indifferently, and then her figure disappeared into the darkness. Today's battle had not yet started, but they had already found the location of the Shadow Lord. There would be a big battle next, which would determine the pattern of the rogues in the material plane for thousands of years to come. Shadow Lord, Shadow Church, Shadow Thief. Soren, Half-Elf Church, Mordor City. If Soren could defeat the Shadow Lord, then there would be a true god who combined the priesthood of rogue and shadow. From now on, all forces related to the rogues would be under Soren's command. Similarly, if the Shadow Lord defeated Soren, then his power would also be greatly improved. The battle between the two sides was destined to have one point, that was, from now on, the rogues and the shadow priesthood must be merged. Chapter 8:19. Second update, the wind was cold. Soren stared at the valley in front of him with a cold expression, and his expression was unprecedentedly dignified. A big battle was inevitable after all. The enemy was in the dark while he was in the light. During this period of time, Soren had been spending a lot of energy to find the headquarters of the Shadow Church and the Shadow Thieves. Now, his efforts finally paid off, and he found the headquarters of the enemy. This was a fair and square confrontation. With the cautious character of the Shadow King, it was too difficult for Soren to trick him. Moreover, if the gods wanted to leave, ordinary people really had no way to stop them. Therefore, the safest and most effective way that Soren could choose was to have a big battle with the enemy. The Shadow King could run away. But the Shadow Church and the Shadow Thieves couldn't run away. Soren was forcing the Shadow King to fight with him head-on. Because this time, if he avoided the battle, the Shadow Church's forces in the material plane would be completely wiped out. If a god's church was destroyed by others, it could be said that there was no hope of turning over in the Avatar crisis. Who knew how many people would want to beat a drowning dog and take out the Shadow Lord who had lost all his forces in one go? The same principle could be applied to Soren. If Mordor City was destroyed, Soren would almost be beaten back to his original state. Except for his own strength, it was difficult for him to do anything during the Avatar crisis. "My lord." The figure of the ugly monkey appeared in front of Soren. He respectfully knelt down on one knee and said, "In front is the headquarters of the Shadow Church. Below is a dense underground passage. We have lost a lot of people when we were spying. The Shadow Thieves have set up a lot of traps at the entrance. If we attack by force, I'm afraid we will suffer serious losses." The underground was the Shadow Church. No wonder the other gods couldn't find the headquarters of the Shadow King. They didn't expect him to place the headquarters underground. "I see." Soren nodded calmly, and then said, "Let the others prepare for battle. When the Golem army arrives, you take people to attack from the side." Checkmate. If the battle between the gods was like a game of chess, then Soren was like a general. In fact, if the Shadow Lord did not fight him head-on, he would even dare to flip the chessboard. Destroy the Church of the Shadow Lord and flatten the great temple of the Shadow Lord. At that time, there was no need for Soren to fight him head-on. Just such a serious loss was enough to cause the strength of the Shadow Lord to plummet, and it might even fall directly to the level of lesser divine power. As long as the Shadow Lord's divine power dropped, Soren would be able to take over the shadow divinity even if he didn't kill him. When that happened, Soren's power would increase while the Shadow Lord's power would weaken. Since ancient times, there had never been a lack of deities whose strength had plummeted due to the conflict between churches. Lady Silvermoon was an obvious example. When she was most severely suppressed by the Lady of the Night, the church was almost on the verge of collapse. She was also weakened to a minor divine power. In the end, she had no choice but to ask the goddess of love for protection. This was the limitation of an ordinary god. Soren's strength was also gathered with the believers and divinity. If the half-elf church was destroyed, he would directly fall to a minor divine power. The divinity in his body might be taken away by the law because of losing his divinity. If the number of believers was too small, Soren might even fall from a true god to a demigod. In the past, many gods gradually declined and fell like this. Divinity and divinity were integrated. Unless Soren's divinity reached the level of great, the two could never be separated. The Outer Islands. Motor City. Although Soren did not let Gloria and Fallen Witch participate in this battle, it was impossible to avoid a head-on confrontation with the Shadow Church. Gloria looked very nervous at this moment. She was even ready to teleport to the battlefield at any time. After all, the Shadow Lord was an old god. Moreover, he was a intermediate divine power god, which had a clear advantage over Soren. The relationship between Soren and the Shadow Lord was simply irreconcilable. The battle between the two sides was bound to end with the defeat of the other side. If the Shadow Church could be destroyed this time, even if the Shadow Lord was not killed, it was almost impossible for him to make a comeback. Start the elemental furnace. Lock the teleportation node. The Golem army is assembled. Open the portal. As a high-grade legendary psionic warlock, the High Priest was responsible for the command of this battle. He directly established a connection with the psionic field. The situation was quite similar to the last time when they attacked the Queen of Spiders. Start the teleportation. The Clay Golem army is activated. As a teleportation gate opened, clay golems appeared on the flat ground one after another in the night. The elites of the half-elves and the rogue church had all gathered. Almost 80% of the members of the Judgment Department, the Central Department, and the bishops had arrived on the battlefield. There were groups of rogues in the shadows. At this moment, their expressions were quite nervous because this was a battle to determine the future of the rogues. Whoever's god won, the other party would be able to dominate the world. Moreover, with the combination of the two clergies, shadow and rogue, the areas that everyone could access would increase. That was to say, no matter who won, the followers who served them could increase their strength. Soren's followers had been unable to access the shadow area, and the followers of the Shadow Lord had been unable to access the rogue and tracking areas. Let's begin. Soren's expression finally changed. After perceiving a familiar divine aura from the depths of the ground, he directly ordered, "Let the Golem army clear the way and directly flatten all the traps." The Shadow Lord finally appeared. Although the two sides had not yet fought, they both felt the familiar power of the clergy on each other. A shadow and a rogue, the collision between them was inevitable. The first batch of clay golems and stone golems began to move forward. As soon as they entered the valley, there was a violent explosion, and then 3 golems were directly destroyed on the spot. It's a burst trap. It looks like it was set up by a legendary rogue. This is a spike trap. This is a flame trap. A series of explosions came, or the ground suddenly collapsed. Before they had completely entered the valley, more than 30 of the golems that Soren used to lead the way had been destroyed. If these traps were not destroyed by the golems, who knew how much combat power it would take? Looking at the golems being destroyed one after another, Soren did not even blink at the moment and continued in a deep voice, "The second golem army, continue to move forward." It only took about 10 minutes. Nearly 150 golems were all scrapped in the valley. Most of these golems were clay golems and stone golems, and their challenge rating was at most level 5. If they were bought from the Wizard Alliance, it would be equivalent to wasting nearly 300,000 Kindler. However, Mordor had the ability to make their own golem puppets, so the cost price was about 100,000 Kindler, and the trap set by the Shadow Church would probably need that many Kindler. The second batch of golem army continued to move forward. This time, the number had increased by a lot. There were about 300 golems. Most of them were the cheapest clay golems and stone golems. But this time, there were more than 10 steel golems mixed in. The continuous explosions were still ringing. In the face of Soren's move of using golems, the Shadow Church was obviously very troubled, especially the steel golems mixed in. Many traps were ineffective against them. It was impossible for flesh and blood to resist the traps, but the steel golems did not have so many taboos. There were already priests inside the Shadow Church, and they began to use divine spells to cooperate with the rogues to kill these steel golems. Are they going to send people out already? After Soren found the base of the Shadow Church, he directly used the portal to block the other party's door. This showed that he wanted to wipe them out. When the second batch of golem army was completely destroyed, a mocking smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and he slowly said, "Golem army number 3, attack." The portal was still maintained. As long as Soren was personally in charge, unless the Shadow Lord came to destroy it, the portal would always be in operation, and even if it was destroyed, another one could be opened immediately. Mordor City had enough resources to maintain the portal. The real battle had not yet begun. Soren squandered about 700,000 Kindler golems in just 2 waves of tentative attacks. War was a game that burned money. He dared to challenge the Shadow Lord, not only because of Princess Royal and Eugene, but also the strength of Mordor City itself. The portal continued to operate. The third batch of golem army that arrived was very different, because this time it was the main army of Mordor City that appeared. The clay golems were gone. This time there were about 500 golems, most of which were more advanced stone golems, then there were dozens of steel golems, and finally, there were a few diamond golems. At this moment, the faces of the enemies hidden in the shadows changed. If the clay golems and stone golems were not a threat, then the steel golems and diamond golems were simply nightmares. The rogues had no way to deal with these golems. You can still hold back. Soren had been paying attention to the movements of the Shadow Lord. Seeing that the other party had not moved, he could not help but chuckle and said, "Since you can hold back, then I will also compete with you in patience." The golem army continued to advance. For this war with the Shadow Church, Soren had prepared more than 3 million Kindler golems as consumables. If the Shadow Lord could hold back, then he would patiently use the golem army to exhaust the opponent. To put it bluntly, the golem factory in Mordor City had been operating at full capacity. If the Shadow Lord could hold back, Soren would smash the enemy down today even if he had to spend money. Rich. Skilled. That's how willful he was. Chapter 820. The third wave of golems finally made the Shadow Church unable to sit still. The clay golem could almost be ignored by the golem army sent by Mordor City. This was a complete cannon fodder. But starting from the golems, their combat power had skyrocketed. An ordinary golem weighed up to 2,000 pounds and was about 3 meters tall. Its special ability was slow, which was an enchantment effect. It could make nearby enemies be affected by something similar to slow, and they had to carry out a compulsory test of will. The challenge rating of golems was above 8, and they could fight one-on-one with a profession level of 12 or above. Then there were the more advanced iron golems. The iron golems weighed about 3,500 to 5,000 pounds. Most of the iron golems in Mordor City weighed about 4,000 pounds and were about 3.5 meters tall. The iron golems were enchanted with poison spit, which could spit out poisonous gas within 3 meters around their bodies. If their physique was not enough, they would continue to be poisoned. The challenge rating of the iron golems was higher, and their resistance to physical damage and magic damage was not low. As for the diamond golems, there was no need to mention them. Any one of the legendary level golems was enough to give the Shadow Church a headache for a while. Facing the third wave of golems from Mordor City, the enemies of the Shadow Church finally couldn't sit still. Some wizards and priests began to cast spells to summon shadow creatures, and more shadow thieves and rogues joined the battle. Ah! A blood-curdling scream of near-death rang out. A shadow thief in the middle of the battle couldn't dodge in time. He was hit in the back by an iron golem on the spot. His entire spine was completely twisted under the huge force. He only had time to scream before he died. On the other side, the elites of Mordor City were still conserving their strength. They hadn't joined the battle yet, but the enemy had been suffering continuous casualties. The strength of Mordor City made them full of hope for victory. Even if the enemy was a church that had existed for thousands of years, they still believed that the final victory belonged to Mordor City. Golem army, advance. Sauron watched the battlefield calmly. When the enemies of the Shadow Church began to retreat, he finally gave the order to attack and said in a deep voice, "Prepare to attack." After entering the underground, fight in organized units, don't scatter easily. The Shadow Church finally couldn't afford to waste time. There were no casualties on Mordor City's side, but hundreds of people had died on their side. The followers of the Church of Shadows began to retreat into the underground tunnel, and the golem army that received Sauron's order also began to advance. They were cannon fodder and consumables. If the golem army was destroyed, they could be rebuilt with money. However, if they died, it was basically impossible for them to be revived. As long as they could defeat the Shadow Lord, it would be worth it even if the golem army were to die here. Sauron was now very rich, and there was an endless supply of minerals from Treasure Island. He wouldn't even bat an eyelid if he were to burn 1,000,000 kindler in a war like this. Those from the tribunal, come with me. Bishops, bring up the rear. Ugly Monkey led a team of elite rogues to join the battle. They followed behind the steel golems. With the golems leading the way, the battle was much easier for them. They only needed to look for the fish that slipped through the net. However, as they entered the underground shrine, the paths leading to all directions appeared before their eyes. After all, the Church of Shadows had been in operation for thousands of years. They had dug out countless underground tunnels. At the same time, the corpses of Taurens and shadow creatures began to appear in front of them. Taurens could be tamed. Many powerful beings liked to use Taurens to guard mazes and dungeons, but Taurens had almost no advantage against the steel golems. They were easily crushed by the golems. The enemy would arrive in 30 seconds. Crush them. The elite troops of the tribunal and the bishops entered the depths of the underground, and the elite pirates behind them also began to fight separately. Sauron's goal was to completely wipe out the Shadow Shrine, flatten the entire dungeon, and leave no fish behind. Mordor City, floating island. The battle on Sauron's side continued, and Gloria's work never stopped. Legendary target found in the third tunnel. The High Priest's telepathic message sounded instantly, and then Gloria gave an order, "Number 1 Diamond Golem, go to the third tunnel to support. Order the bishops to send someone to the third tunnel to support. Elite Shadow Thief resistance found in the 5th tunnel. Number 2 Diamond Golem, go to support. Number 3 Diamond Golem, go to support. The priests of the Central Command are approaching. Open the portal." Alice is about to reach the battlefield, in a pitch-black underground tunnel. The members of the Half-Elf Church and the Shadow Church had already been fighting together. The resistance of the Shadow Thieves was a bit more than expected. When a small team of Shadow Wizards began to join the battle, the casualties of Mordor City began to rise rapidly. However, at this moment, a delicate girl appeared in this tunnel. She didn't look like a Westerner, and her body had obvious Oriental characteristics. Poochie. A cold light flashed, and the Shadow Wizard, who was casting a spell, suddenly felt a chill in his throat. Then, he couldn't make any sound. At this time, intense pain came, and blood gushed out of his throat like a fountain. In front of him was a small and exquisite puppet girl about 15 centimeters tall. This lifelike puppet girl floated in midair, holding a very pocket-sized long sword in her hand. The fatal blow just now was caused by her Eastern puppet master. As if thinking of something, the shadow wizard in front of him was horrified, but everything was too late. Another puppet girl appeared behind him and ended the shadow wizard's life in an instant. These puppet girls, who were only a dozen centimeters tall, moved like the wind. They were undetectable in this dark environment. They were like assassins in the dark, constantly reaping the lives of the enemy. Alice's expression was calm. As a legendary puppet master, she had experienced a lot of battles and killings. Originally, her puppet girls were not as powerful as they were now, but after obtaining the alchemy knowledge of Motor City, Alice had upgraded all her puppet maids once. She was the one who volunteered to participate in this battle because she wanted to test how much stronger her newly upgraded rune maids were compared to before. So far, the improved combat power of the puppet girls had exceeded her expectations. Chapter 8:21. The Church of Shadows was losing ground. Although there were not many casualties in the city of Mordor, there were probably more than 2 million Kindler golems that had been damaged. Arendel's tax last year was only more than 1 million Kindler golems, which meant that Soren had squandered the equivalent of 2 years of Arendel's tax in less than an hour. However, this price was worth it. If they didn't use so many golems to clear the way, the half-elf church would have to pay thousands of casualties just to attack the underground. Human lives could not be bought with money. Soren only had so much money, and it would be a heavy loss if all of his core followers were killed. The same principle could be applied to the Lord of Shadows. He had never underestimated Soren's strength, and he had always regarded Soren as a threatening enemy. However, he still underestimated the power of Mordor City. That's right. The Lord of Shadows had guessed Soren's own strength, but he did not guess the hidden power of Mordor City. In the view of the Lord of Shadows, he definitely had a 70% to 80% chance of winning against Soren, so he took the initiative to attack Soren's church believers. But what he never thought was that the power of the Shadow Thieves and the Church of Shadows combined was absolutely impossible to defeat Mordor City, which had the support of the Northern Witch Council, Arendel's Ice Witches, and the Church of the City of Wealth. The Lord of Shadows had lost. But he did not lose to Soren's personal strength, but to Soren's influence in the secular world. Because some of these golems came from the Northern Witch Council. In order to get the floating ring technology of Mordor City, the Eye of the North also paid a big price, and some of the steel golems that participated in the battle today came from the Tower of the Northern Witch. The secular power of the Lord of Shadows had lost. It was impossible for the Church of Shadows and the Union of Shadow Thieves to fight against Mordor City alone, so there was only one chance for him to turn the tables, and that was to rely on his personal strength to kill Soren. As long as Soren died, the power of Mordor City would immediately collapse. Even with his shadow clergy, after killing Soren, he might be able to take over a large part of Mordor's power. Given the current situation, there was no way out for the Shadow Lord. Since he dared to avoid the battle, the Church of Shadows would definitely be destroyed today. Soren would definitely flatten his great temple in the material plane. As a god, there was no way he could sit back and watch the church be destroyed. Therefore, his only choice was to fall into Soren's trap and force the Lord of Shadows to attack him. Then, he would activate the most crucial part of his plan. A powerful divine power surged from the underground city. Soren also sensed something at that moment. He narrowed his eyes and muttered, "You can't hold it in anymore?" He was forcing the Shadow King to attack him. Even if Soren was the Shadow Lord, there were only two choices he could make. One was to give up on the Church of Shadows and evacuate. The other was to kill the gods of the enemy church and directly disintegrate the attack of Mordor City. Shadow Realm. An invisible force spread, and the shadows around suddenly became more and more hazy. Soren disappeared in an instant. The next moment, the space where he was distorted, and then a dark void crack appeared. So this is what you look like. The power of the shadow dissipated, and Soren's figure appeared 10 meters away. He looked at the front with a cold expression and said slowly, "The legendary Shadow Lord is actually a distorted shadow." Right in front of Soren, a distorted human-shaped shadow was suspended in midair. This was a special life form. The Shadow Lord gave up his flesh and blood and directly transformed his body into a half-energy life form with shadow energy. This form of god was rarely seen in the pantheon because most gods could not completely give up their flesh and blood. "Since you've already appeared, then stay." A strange light appeared near Soren's wrist, and then there was a violent fluctuation in the surrounding space. The next moment, the nearby temperature plummeted, and the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost in an instant. Ice realm. Princess Royal's proud figure appeared hundreds of meters away. The ability of the gods to change space blocked short-distance teleportation. Even she could only teleport 100 meters away. The god of half-elves and rogues. The voice of the Shadow Lord was as empty as the void. He looked at Soren indifferently and said slowly, "Is this your last card? You want to kill me with the help of a mere mortal?" Princess Royal did not become a god. That was to say, in the eyes of the Shadow Lord, no matter how powerful she was just a mortal. Mortals were still too weak for gods. Of course. This was just what the Shadow Lord thought. In the face of the Shadow Lord's contempt, Princess Royal's expression was obviously a little unhappy, but she did not say anything. Instead, she used the power of ice and snow to block the surroundings in an instant. As the most powerful mortal in the material plane, although she had the power of a god, neither she nor Soren could kill the Shadow Lord alone. "Of course I won't look down on you." Soren's mouth evoked a sarcastic smile, and said slowly, "Since I'm going to deal with you, I naturally have to prepare more helpers." Bang! About 300 meters away from Soren, a burly and old figure slowly appeared. It was a half-orc who looked resolute but had already entered its twilight years. Its bare chest was painted with gray-white paint, which was the ashes of half-orc warriors. The war shamans relied on them to awaken the power of the ancient ancestral spirits. Divine Ascender, Eugene. The old half-orc approached step by step. With every step he took, his aura became stronger. When Eugene gradually approached the Shadow Lord, he took the white bone spear that was surrounded by the ancestral spirit's light from his back. His whole body could not help but exude a wild aura. A faint shadow appeared behind him. It was the incarnation of the half-orc's oldest ancestral spirits. They were once legendary figures of the half-orc race. With the power of the ancestral sacrifice, they gradually turned into powerful spirits. Demigod? The Shadow Lord's expression finally changed. Compared to Princess Royal, who did not reveal her divine power, Divine Ascender, Eugene's body had obvious demigod characteristics. This power was obtained by Eugene after killing the Lesser Demon Lord. Compared to the divine power hidden in Princess Royal's blood, Divine Ascender, Eugene's divine power from the bottomless abyss was more violent. At this moment, Eugene, who had activated all his power, had a trace of the evil god of the abyss. A true god, a demigod, and a mortal who was about to become a god. When Soren, Princess Royal, and Eugene surrounded the Shadow Lord, his expression finally changed. This was because even if he was an intermediate divine power, he would not be able to survive being surrounded by so many enemies. More importantly, there was one more thing. These three enemies all had a strong godly power on them. Chapter 8:22. The Lord of Shadows was a confident and scheming god. He liked to plan all kinds of secret plots, although his plans could easily put himself in danger. The Lord of Shadows was alert and cold. He never lost control of his emotions, and his appearance was always changing. Therefore, no one knew his true face. Soren was now facing his true body. Usually, in the eyes of the believers and the outside world, the Lord of Shadows was always changing. Many people were afraid of the Church of the Lord of Shadows, not only because of its cruelty, but also because of its hobby of stealing and lurking in the shadows. Most outsiders thought that the Church of the Lord of Shadows was just a thieves' union organized in the name of religion. Note, this is very true. The priests of the Lord of Shadows often worked as assassins, bards, divine power seekers, thieves, shadow sorcerers, shadow dancers, and so on. Speaking of which, the Lord of Shadows was also a very unlucky god. This was because his predecessor had offended the chaos demon dog, Kozerv. Although the original god of thieves, Max, had fallen, the Lord of Shadows still inherited this hatred. Furthermore, the Lady of the Night was always eyeing him covetously. Only God knew how much Lady Shar wanted to take over the shadow priesthood, so he had been hiding ever since he became a god, not daring to show his true face. The Lord of Shadows was a very rich god, but his interpersonal relationship was not very good. He had always been hostile to the goddess of wealth. Is that all? Facing Soren and the others surrounding him, a sarcastic smile appeared on the Lord of Shadows' face. Then he slowly pulled out a long sword. Buzz! The long sword trembled violently the moment it came out of the sheath. The Lord of Shadows did not seem to think of this, and his expression was quite strange. As for Soren's reaction, it was much more intense. His expression changed almost instantly. His expression seemed to be a little excited and fanatical. At the same time, his face was slightly pale at first, and then it became a strange red color. Godslayer? Soren almost instantly recognized the weapon because he had tried to find it before, but it was after the Avatar crisis. Godslayer? Upon hearing Soren's words, Princess Royal's expression changed immediately. She immediately cast several defensive spells on herself. However, Eugene, the Divine Ascender, was a little slow in reacting. The name of the Godslayer was a little scary, but Eugene was not knowledgeable enough to understand the significance of the sword, so he could only remain vigilant. Seeing Soren's shocked expression, the Shadow Lord said with a hint of mockery, "I didn't expect you to recognize this sword." Of course they knew each other. How could Soren not recognize the god-slaying sword? After all, the sword had a lot to do with him. The story had to start from the first Avatar crisis. A long time ago, there was a large-scale Avatar crisis in the material plane. At that time, many gods also fell to the mortal world for some reason. One of the masterminds was the core of the gods in the evil camp at that time, which was the original, three gods of death. The former god of the Shadow Lord, who was known as the god of thieves at that time, turned himself into a divine weapon in order to avoid the danger of the Avatar crisis. That was the legendary God Slayer. This sword fell into the hands of Sirik, who was still immortal at that time. That was the god of murder, who was now sealed because of his madness. Sirik, who was still immortal at that time, used this sword to kill Baal, one of the three gods of death. He was the origin of all the God Slayer. Not only Soren's bloodline power, but as early as the end of the last time of troubles, Baal's bloodline had set off a huge storm in the material plane. In the end, it even forced the gods in the upper plane to make a judgment. In a way, the bloodline of the God Slayer started because of this God Slayer. Baal foresaw his own death at that time, so many God Slayer were born. After that, the god of thieves, Mexer, betrayed the goddess of shadows, Lila, to Sirik, so that the god of murder could obtain the clergy of shadows. But later, the god of thieves went further and further on the road of seeking death. He became the victim of the god of murder's madness. He also read the book that could be called a taboo, and finally lost the clergy of conspiracy. Of course, what was worse was that Mexer later provoked the chaos demonic hound, Kozerv. If it weren't for this series of events, perhaps the current Shadow Lord wouldn't have risen. It was because the god of thieves in the past was too reckless. In the end, the clergy was divided into two, and the Shadow Lord was born. I didn't expect the God Slayer to be in your hands. Soren's expression was unprecedentedly serious, and he said slowly, "It seems that the death of the previous god of thieves was not that simple. The God Slayer was definitely not a fake. As a son of murder, Soren could feel the power on it. This divine weapon had the divine power of slaughter. When the god of murder used this sword to kill Baal, the divine weapon that the god of thieves turned into also gained a lot of benefits. Other things could be deceived, but the power of the bloodline of slaughter could not be deceived. You mean this? The Shadow Lord gently waved the weapon in his hand, and a powerful divine power immediately burst out. He smiled contemptuously and said, "Mexer's soul has been imprisoned by me. Since he likes to become a weapon so much, I might as well refine him into a divine weapon forever." It was no wonder that the Lady of Night could hold back for so long. The Godslayer even killed Baal, who was one of the 3 gods of death. If this weapon could kill the 3 gods of death, it could also kill some powerful existences. For an ancient deity like the Lady of Night, any action that risked her life was not worth it. Be careful of this weapon. Soren's voice rang in the minds of the other 2. He said slowly, "The Godslayer once killed the god of murder, Baal. I don't know how much power this divine weapon still retains. But you guys still have to be careful in the upcoming battle." A mistake. Soren realized that he had made a small mistake. Although he did not guess the Shadow Lord's strength wrongly, he did not expect a weapon like the Godslayer to still exist in the multiverse. There was definitely a problem with the fall of the previous god of thieves, Mexer. Logically speaking, the Godslayer should have disappeared with him. But now was not the time to think so much. Although Soren did not expect this, he was not completely without confidence. This was because he had made other preparations from the very beginning. In his extra-dimensional space, there was another divine weapon that could fight against the Godslayer. Although Soren felt that it was quite difficult to fight with this weapon. Chapter 8:23. The Shadow Lord took the initiative. But the target was not Soren, but the weakest of the 3, Princess Royal. She was the only one who did not exude an obvious divine aura. Since Princess Royal had used some means to disperse the excess divine power in her body, her control of power had become more and more subtle. Unlike in the past, she could not perceive the violent divine power in her body at a glance. No matter from which point of view, the Shadow Lord's choice was not wrong. After all, Princess Royal was the most threatening spellcaster. But he obviously did not expect that Princess Royal's strength was actually stronger than Soren's. If it was a one-on-one fight, Soren and Princess Royal's chances of winning were about 4 to 6, and Princess Royal had at least a 20% higher chance of winning. Ice prison. Even someone as powerful as the Princess Royal did not dare to be careless in the face of the Shadow Overlord, who wielded the Godslayer. She instantly distanced herself from the Shadow Overlord, and at the same time, cast a large number of defensive spells on herself. Then, she activated the divine power of ice in her body and directly froze all the land in front of her. A piece of frost spread rapidly at a speed visible to the naked eye. The whole space seemed to have entered the extreme north all of a sudden, and even the space seemed to be frozen. Soren and Eugene's reaction speed was also very fast. As soon as the Shadow Lord moved, Eugene roared, and then the shadow behind him overlapped with his figure. In an instant, the whole person was like a god with a glimmer of divine brilliance. Heroic spirit fusion. In the past, Eugene was not enough to enter the demigod state, and naturally could not fully accommodate the power of the heroic spirit. But now, after absorbing the divine power of the lesser demon lord, he could no longer be regarded as an ordinary demigod. The white bone spear roared out. With a huge power that could destroy the world, Eugene threw the spear in his hand directly. In an instant, it broke through the space and made a sharp sonic boom. The next moment, the location where the Shadow Lord was located seemed to have been bombed by a missile, and a huge crater appeared directly. Eugene is already so strong? Soren's pupils slightly shrank, and he couldn't help being surprised. He had absorbed the power of a lesser demon overlord before. There was an unlucky guy who was bewitched by the Queen of Spiders to absorb a lesser demon lord. Unfortunately, that guy was too weak and was controlled by the Queen of Spiders. As a hero who rose from the grassroots, Eugene's will naturally couldn't be measured by common sense. Perhaps he had completely suppressed the backlash of the secondary demon overlord's power. Ancient ancestral spirits. Heed my call. Eugene the divine ascender chanted in the ancient orc language. Then, the illusions of heroic spirits appeared behind him again, but this time, there were more of them. More than 10 legendary heroic spirits appeared behind him, providing him with endless power. Eugene was about to become a god. Based on Eugene's current strength, Soren was sure that Eugene had mastered the half-orc domain, which meant that he could control all the half-orc ancestral spirits. Once Eugene became a god, all of these ancestral spirits would become Eugene's oracles. The power brought by the ancestral spirits of the orcs for thousands of years was amazing. If Eugene could take these powers as his own, then it was very likely that he would directly be promoted to a lesser divine power. Because so far, he was the only orc who had the potential to become a god. In this way, if Eugene became a god, he would become the only god of the orcs. The only god of the race was destined to be stronger than other new gods. Divinity power, to change space. Divinity power, to change reality. As the number one meat shield among the three, Eugene rushed forward and intercepted the Shadow Lord. The three of them had already studied the tactics of how to deal with the Shadow Lord. Eugene was naturally an irreplaceable meat shield, and Princess Royal was the main damage output against the Shadow Lord. As for Soren's role, the core was still to use the divinity power to confront the Shadow Lord. He must use the divinity power to offset the suppression ability of the Shadow Lord. Only when the divinity power of the true gods collided could the other two have a chance to attack. Dang! Dang! In the blink of an eye, Eugene and the Shadow Lord had exchanged hundreds of moves. As expected of an existence that could fight against the ancient brass dragon as soon as he appeared, Eugene's ability to fight head-on completely surpassed Soren's. And because there was a super meat shield in front, Princess Royal also had time to cast spells calmly. Although Soren was just wandering around, his divine power value was constantly decreasing because he could offset the Shadow Lord's divinity realm. Only by using the divinity power to seal the Shadow Lord's ability to jump between planes could others attack this dangerous enemy. Melf's Minute Meteor. Eugene's current state was not bad. Although the Shadow Lord's immunity to physical damage was very high, Princess Royal's spells were still effective. Soren used Melf's Minute Meteor to harass and attack while always looking for opportunities to use big moves. The balance of the battle was tilting. The three of them joined forces to besiege the Shadow Lord. Even if the other party had the legendary Godslayer in his hand, his situation was getting worse. But an accident happened just as the battle was about to tilt. Crack. The three people who had the upper hand suddenly turned into a disadvantage because of one thing. Eugene's weapon was broken. Just as the three of them joined forces to beat the Shadow Lord until he was more and more powerless to resist, the white bone spear in Eugene's hand was suddenly cut off by the Shadow Lord after a parry. The situation became very dangerous in an instant. Shadow Clone. The figure of the Shadow Lord split into three in an instant, and three identical Shadow Lords appeared in front of Soren. Immediately afterward, the other two figures of the Shadow Lord rushed from two sides and directly besieged Eugene, who had been entangled with him. The next moment, Eugene's old and burly body shook, and the two avatars of the Shadow Lord directly waved the Godslayer into Eugene's heart. Real avatars. The two avatars of the Shadow Lord were real shadow beings. With the white bone spear cut off, Eugene could not avoid the enemy's attack at all. Then, the Shadow Lord mercilessly pierced his heart. Poochie. A stream of blood gushed out. Eugene, who was stabbed in the heart by the enemy, did not die because of this. His strong vitality still made him stand. This was the power of the legendary ability, Epic Toughness. Even fatal damage could not kill him. Roar. Eugene, who was stabbed in the heart, seemed to have stimulated the madness in his heart. He did not care and just roared and grabbed the Godslayer that pierced his heart with his bare hands. A terrible power broke out. After all, the Shadow Lord was only strong in agility. The weapon was grabbed by Eugene and could not be pulled out. You're tuning into the Dreamy Love Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.